Kitzbühel is a small Austrian town located with a population of just over 8,000 people. Despite its size, more than 20,000 tourists visit every winter, drawn by the local mountain slopes. For many decades, this place has been known as a winter resort for the wealthy. Additionally, there are numerous celebrations that attract athletes and fans from around the world. Since October 2018, the ski slopes have been prepared before the winter season. The hotels and tourism companies have been making the final preparations to welcome numerous guests. However, the joyful events were overshadowed by the horrific murders. Nadine Hinterholzer was born in Austria, grew up in a close-knit family. From an early age, she was energetic, cheerful, and quite pretty. She had a large circle of friends who loved her for her straightforwardness, good sense of humor, and pleasant demeanor. Nadine lived with her parents and older brother in a spacious house in Kitzbühel. At the age of 14, significant changes began in her life when she met a guy named Andreas E., who was 20 at the time. He already looked like an adult, while she was still a teenager. A 6-year age difference at that age can seem significant. Despite this, they felt a mutual attraction. After several dates, they began a romantic relationship in secret from Nadine's relatives. Eventually, they both realized that age could pose the greatest obstacle in their relationship. Nadine was concerned that her older boyfriend could face legal issues because of his involvement with a minor, but they were reluctant to break up. At first, Nadine carefully hinted to her parents about the significant changes in her life, which raised some alarms for her mother and father. However, Andreas was determined and decided to take a bold step. He personally approached Nadine's family to seek permission for their relationship. From the beginning, he emphasized that this was not a fleeting affair. He wanted to build a future with her but did not want to rush her, allowing her to finish school and pursue her education. Andreas was familiar with her brother, Kevin. Soon after meeting, they became close friends. During home visits, Andreas's initiative was highly appreciated by Nadine's parents, especially after she described him as well-mannered, polite, and loving. Overall, the family liked Andreas, so they permitted Nadine to continue their relationship. Nadine had just entered the challenging teenage years. Her parents believed that a relationship with an older boyfriend could positively influence her, as he could take care of her and protect her from unpleasant situations. Andreas acted as though Nadine meant a lot to him, growing closer to her family. Initially, they spent all their free time together, and after 3 years, Andreas moved in with them. Nadine and Andreas posted statuses on social media indicating their engagement. While Andreas had intentions of getting married, he respected Nadine's desires to finish school and make her own life decisions before rushing into marriage. They continued dating for several years, to the point where Nadine's family began to treat Andreas like their own son. Finally, Nadine turned 18, officially becoming an adult, while Andreas was already 24. They decided it was time to move out and live independently. Nadine's grandmother significantly assisted them by offering her apartment for Nadine and Andreas to settle in. By this time, Nadine had completed her schooling. She intended to continue her studies at college. She did not plan on marriage or children, which disappointed Andreas slightly, as she wanted to establish herself first. Nadine enrolled in driving school and attended classes with her friends, who often picked her up. She aspired to become a professional dancer and build a career in this field. To their relatives, Nadine and Andreas represented the epitome of romance. Although the age difference made their relationship seem unconventional, it was evident that their bond was built on love and mutual understanding. It seemed as though their lives were just beginning, with no threats on the horizon. Andreas had faced Nadine's transitional phase early in their relationship when she was just 14, and they had managed to cope with that difficult period, maintaining, even strengthening their bond. However, after she reached adulthood, some other challenges began to emerge in their relationship. Andreas was seriously determined to pursue further development, family life, and children, but he could not achieve the same aspirations from his beloved. A 24-year-old man, he worked as a bricklayer and spent the lion's share of his time, energy on his job. Upon returning home in the evening, he just wanted to relax with his girlfriend in their apartment, but this did not meet the new needs of an 18-year-old. While she had already become an adult, she still wanted to relax, spend time with friends, and go to parties. Previously, they had constantly gone out together, but now Andreas wanted to spend time at home in front of the TV, which was too boring for Nadine. Initially, she managed to persuade him to go for walks or spend time outside their home, but over time, this became nearly impossible. Andreas began to refuse such outings, citing fatigue and stating that he had to work in the morning. He complained that he wanted to relax and recharge but felt unsupported by her. During this period, the age difference between them became particularly apparent. Nadine was at the peak of her activity and craved entertainment, while she realized that Andreas had already moved past that phase of life, who now had other interests. However, she was not willing to adjust to him or give in. She wanted to live the life of a young woman, socialize, and have fun with her friends. All of this led to conflicts beginning to arise between them. Nadine even told Andreas that if this continued, she would have to break up with him. Despite her repeatedly expressing this not only to him but also to her friends and relatives, he did not take her words seriously. He saw no reason for a breakup, insisting that he still loved her, hoped she would calm down over time and everything would return to normal. He continued planning a lavish wedding, believing it was the right time since their relationship had lasted for 5 years. He wanted to change his social media status from engaged to married, but her insistence on remaining single, along with her constant reproaches and talk of breaking up, loomed over their relationship. Andreas increasingly became intrusive and rude. Nadine felt that he simply wanted to control her completely and grew angry that he could not succeed. She even began to tell her friends that they had always had problems that she had kept silent about. In the summer of 2018, Nadine made the firm decision to break up, but she did not want any conflict. She hoped they could maintain a friendly relationship. At that time, she was 19 years old, and Andreas was already 25. According to Nadine, her boyfriend was never cruel or aggressive and did not limit her communication with others. The major issue was his passivity and jealousy. He could not stand it when she was in the company of other guys. She even lost all her male friends after meeting Andreas at the age of 14. Nadine told her friend that they had decided to separate and live apart. She was sure that her boyfriend took it calmly. She believed their relationship was officially over after 5 years together. Nadine and Andreas stopped dating. He moved out of her grandmother's apartment and returned to his parents' house. The idea of maintaining friendly relations seemed to work as they both had mutual friends and kept in touch with their families. Andreas continued to be friends with Nadine's older brother, Kevin, as if nothing had happened. They were peers and had a lot in common. However, this was the calm before the storm. During this period, doubts began to surface during their communication. Nadine increasingly suspected that Andreas was not taking the breakup calmly. Kevin thought Andreas had accepted this as another whim of his girlfriend and was simply waiting for a signal from Nadine regarding the restoration of their relationship. The friends had discussed this many times. Andreas could not accept that it was truly over. Thoughts and conversations about his ex consumed almost all of his time. Andreas's behavior approached obsession. He seized every opportunity to communicate with Nadine, asking for a second chance, trying to win her back, even continuing to talk about marriage and children. Within the first month of the breakup, it became clear that Andreas did not understand the situation and was simply in denial. He did not realize that they were no longer a couple. Each time Nadine firmly said no, insisting that everything was over between them, she labeled their relationship as her youthful mistake, even confiding this to her other friends. All of this hurt Andreas, but he continued to endure. He still hoped for a reconciliation. Some of his friends sympathized with him, but by the end of the second month after the breakup, they too began to notice that his behavior resembled stalking. He showed up everywhere Nadine went, always initiating conversation. Andreas's persistence caused Nadine to start avoiding him. She tried to gently indicate that their relationship was over, but he only became more determined. When she tried to stop their meetings, he made efforts to interact with her. Nadine's friends and family knew that she was consistently rejecting his advances, but he was spreading different stories to his own circle. Even 2 months after the breakup, he still believed that she wanted to be with him and thought she was only trying to make him pursue her. Kevin tried to tell Andreas to move on and date other girls, but he remained stubborn. As of October 5, 2018, the situation remained unchanged. Nadine and Andreas had officially been separated for 3 months. Nadine's entire family was aware of the breakup. Even his parents tried to convince him to reconsider. That evening, Andreas spent time with Kevin. They visited several bars but didn't stay long in any of them. Eventually, they ended up at one bar, where Kevin unexpectedly saw Nadine. He found it surprising to run into her, especially since, despite the town being small, there were enough bars catering to tourists that it was unlikely they would see each other regularly. Andreas appeared to either be following Nadine, receiving updates on her location, or simply searching for her as he moved between various places throughout the evening. Kevin knew that for the past 3 months, Andreas had been claiming that he and Nadine loved each other and intended to get married once he won her back. While similar situations had occurred before, this time things were different. Nadine was not just with her friend, she was also accompanied by another man. When Andreas noticed this, he instantly became angry, approached Nadine, taking her hand and starting an argument. He attempted to pull her out of the bar, but she resisted. Her 24-year-old friend, Florian Jani, intervened, positioning himself between Andreas and Nadine. He insisted that he was merely a friend and not romantically involved with her, claiming they had only just met. Nonetheless, Andreas was not calmed by this explanation. He was furious that Nadine was spending time with another man and struggled to contain his anger, nearly provoking a fight in the bar. Nadine, Florian, and her brother worked hard to soothe him, prevented Andreas from asserting control over Nadine. After significant effort, they managed to calm him down, though he was still in tears. Feeling overwhelmed, Andreas chose to leave the bar, not wanting to remain in that environment. Kevin stayed behind with Nadine and Florian, worried about their safety. Andreas' outburst was alarming, and now Nadine felt genuinely concerned for her well-being. She didn't want to remain in the bar either, but feared that her ex might be waiting outside. After waiting to ensure Andreas had left, the entire group decided to walk Nadine home. Florian drove her back, even offered to stay the night to help her feel safe. Overwhelmed by fear, Nadine accepted his offer. This choice would prove to have significant consequences. Around 4 a.m., Andreas could no longer contain his jealousy and chose to contact his ex again. When he reached her house, he noticed an unfamiliar car in the driveway, which he recognized as Florian's. It became clear that Andreas hadn't gone home after leaving the bar. Instead, he had remained in the parking lot, secretly watching the group. He observed that Florian was with Nadine, while no one else had left the house. This only fueled his anger. Andreas suspected that Nadine was lying and dating someone new. He felt they were enjoying themselves together without a care. He resolved to confront both Nadine and Florian about the situation. Furious, Andreas jumped out of his car and started ringing the doorbell while banging on the front door. Instead of Nadine and her friend, her father, 59-year-old Rupert, answered. He came out to calm Andreas, who was shouting. Rupert insisted it was too late for arguments and asked Andreas to leave until morning, when they could discuss everything calmly. Rupert was aware of the situation involving Florian at the bar, reassured Andreas that Nadine and Florian were just friends. Understanding and approachable, Rupert shared a cigarette with Andreas, invited him to talk outside on the street. They had a conversation on various topics, as Rupert probably hoped this would soothe Andreas and persuade him to leave. Having known each other for several years, Andreas had become a valued member of Nadine's family. Nadine's parents treated him well, which is why Rupert chose not to call the police to remove his daughter's ex-boyfriend. After speaking with Rupert, Andreas seemed to feel less agitated. He got into his car and drove off, while Rupert returned inside to go to bed. However, just a short distance down the road, Andreas began to feel annoyed again. He came back 15 minutes later, knocking on the door and ringing the bell, which disturbed everyone in the house. Nadine and Kevin came out to confront him. Unlike Rupert, they were very upset, wanted to make it clear that Andreas needed to leave. A new argument broke out at the front door. No one was holding back their words. Nadine was determined to completely cut off ties with her bothersome ex and insisted that there should be no further relationship between them. She demanded that he vanish from her life for good. Kevin backed his sister, stating that their friendship was overdue to Andreas's stalking behavior. He was worried about Andreas's unhealthy actions and wanted nothing more to do with him. Meanwhile, Andreas felt betrayed, convinced that Nadine had been unfaithful and that Kevin was protecting her. He now felt abandoned by Kevin, who he believed should have supported him instead. Before leaving, Andreas tried to find out if Nadine had cheated. However, she firmly told him it was not his concern since they hadn't been dating for several months. At that moment, Andreas had a shocking realization: Nadine had actually broken up with him 3 months ago, and all his attempts to win her back were in vain. No one expected him to pursue her anymore. Feeling angry, Andreas decided to go home, choosing to avoid confronting his feelings of hurt. At 5:30 a.m. on October 6, 2018, Andreas returned to his ex's house. He began knocking on the door and ringing the doorbell, but he did not shout. This time, Rupert responded. He was already very irritated because Andreas had kept the whole family awake the previous night. When Rupert opened the door, he intended to angrily chase Andreas away and threaten to call the police, but he was cut off before he could finish. Andreas pulled out a gun, shot him in the head twice, killing him instantly. He then stepped over Rupert's body and entered the house. Nadine's mother, 51-year-old Andrea, rushed outside when she heard the noise. Tragically, she became the next victim. Andreas then attacked Kevin. He went upstairs and attempted to enter Nadine's room, but Nadine and Florian had locked the door. Andreas determined that the quickest way to reach her was through the balcony. He went outside, climbed the bars on the building's facade, broke the window, opened fire on both Nadine and her friend Florian. This horrific event unfolded within just a few minutes, resulting in the deaths of 5 people. After committing the crime, Andreas drove to the Kitzbühel police station. He arrived around 6 a.m. and placed a gun in front of a police officer at the entrance. He confessed to having just shot 5 people. Additionally, he handed over a knife and a baseball bat, which he had used to break into the Hinterholzer home. He used the bat to shatter a window and gain access to Nadine's room. While the knife was never used, it appears he brought it along for safety. The police discovered 5 bodies at the scene, and the details of their deaths confirmed Andreas's account. Each victim had been attacked at close range with multiple bullets. Florian suffered gunshot wounds to his hands as he tried to defend himself. There was nothing missing from the house. The toxicology report indicated that Andreas was sober, with no alcohol or banned substance in his system. He had no prior legal issues. The entire community of Kitzbühel was in shock over the incident. In this close-knit town, crimes, especially such violent ones, were extremely rare. All the neighbors were familiar with the Nadine family, known for their kindness and helpfulness. They had good relationships with everyone in the area. Both the victim's family and the suspect's family were respected in the community. The community especially mourned the loss of Florian Jani, a talented young hockey player and goalkeeper, who was seen as a promising individual. His compassion for Nadine ultimately led to his tragic death. Friends who knew Nadine well later stated that she had no romantic involvement with Florian. They were simply friends who enjoyed good conversations. However, some speculated that Florian stayed the night to protect her, and suggested that they might have already begun dating. Following the tragedy, a small memorial with photographs of the victims was set up in the local church. Over the course of the month it remained there. More than 1,000 heartfelt notes were left by mourners and caring individuals in memory of the victims. Andreas had been in custody in a special cell designed for inmates needing extra supervision. The police considered him at high risk for end one's own life, so they monitored him closely. He spent 23 hours a day in solitary confinement and was allowed only 1 hour outside to walk in the yard. When the family of Andreas learned what had happened, they addressed the town's residents, expressed their condolences. They also informed the police that a gun belonging to Andreas's brother was missing. The brother had a permit for the firearm, which he kept at home for self-defense. Unfortunately, Andreas knew how to access it and where the key to the safe was. The gun's serial numbers matched, and Andreas confirmed that he had stolen the gun from the house. At a press conference, Andreas's parents expressed their belief that he should face appropriate consequences for his actions. They mentioned that their son's mental health had declined while he was in prison. Despite widespread public anger, the family attempted to explain Andreas's behavior. His father stated that Andreas had been struggling with depression, particularly following his breakup with Nadine. His mother added that while her son might have had mental health challenges, it is unclear why he and his family never pursued mental health treatment. Andreas faces charges for murdering 5 people with a firearm and for breaking and entering. Andreas's lawyer intends to base their defense on his client's questionable mental state. Andreas claims that after hearing hurtful remarks from Nadine and her brother, who attempted to force him out of the house, he lost touch with reality and was unable to control his actions. He states that the only thought in his mind was his desire to kill the cheater. He described this experience as a state of emotional turmoil. The lawyer hoped this would reduce his client's culpability. However, the prosecution argued that Andreas was merely pretending and insisted that he was aware of his actions, he fit to stand trial. The lawyer disagreed with this assessment. In the end, the court ruled that there were no grounds for reducing Andreas's criminal responsibility. Andreas believed he deserved a fair punishment and did not want to evade responsibility for his crime. From the outset, he intended to confess. He willingly went to the police station and had no plans to take back his confession made the morning after the massacre. His lawyers stressed Andreas's mental state during the case. Assessments revealed that he suffered from a disorder that left him with 2 choices: either walk away and forget or return to kill. There was no middle ground. Once he understood that he could not regain his relationship with Nadine, he became obsessed with the notion that Nadine should not belong to anyone. As soon as the murder trial started, Andreas confessed to the crime. He believed that confessing would make the legal process easier and reduce trauma for the victims' families, as well as for himself. He shared details about his relationship with Nadine, discussing his jealousy and the reasons behind his actions. He described Nadine as an attractive girl who attracted many admirers, which fueled his jealousy. Andreas held traditional views about women and felt that a good woman should behave differently. He couldn't accept Nadine's decision to break up, insisting that she was his property and that she shouldn't date or spend time with other men, even as just friends. On the night of the incident, he was also affected by Kevin's betrayal. Nadine's parents were annoyed with Andreas, and he was afraid of losing her entire family, with whom he felt closer than to his own. He claimed that after the breakup, his family did not provide the support he desperately needed, leading him to lose 10 kilograms. Ultimately, in a moment of rage, Andreas lost control and killed them all. Andreas showed remorse and offered condolences to the families of his victims, but some believed he was merely trying to get a lighter sentence. Prosecution witnesses testified that Nadine continuously told Andreas that their relationship was over. Despite this, he kept asking for another chance, hoping to get back together, and he stalked her without truly grasping the situation. During the hearing, Andreas came across as insecure. He spoke softly, often mumbling to himself, and cried during emotional moments. At times, he seemed to misunderstand the gravity of what happened, viewing it as an accident. The prosecution contended that there was clear evidence of a brutal, premeditated murder involving 5 victims. They argued that Andreas had ample time to think through his actions as he drove to and from his ex-girlfriend's house. When he returned home, he took 3 items: a gun, a knife, and a baseball bat, indicating that he had meticulously planned his actions. The choice to take a knife suggested he intended to ensure there would be no survivors among Nadine's family and her friend Florian. During the hearing, the prosecution pointed out that Andreas had changed his marital status on social media from engaged to widower. Andreas claimed that this change occurred shortly after Nadine's murder, but some friends and acquaintances suggested that Andreas may have done so intentionally beforehand. Just a few months after their breakup, he started reacting more aggressively to Nadine's rejections. He often expressed a desire for her to be dead and sent messages accusing her of dating someone new, voicing a wish to kill that person. At the time, these statements were not taken seriously. The lawyer argued that these were simply emotional responses to rejection, which Andreas struggled to accept. However, this did not necessarily mean he intended to kill her. Nadine's friends mentioned that she had been feeling fearful of her ex lately and had been trying to avoid him as much as she could. She discovered that Andreas had been engaging in violent acts, such as beheading chickens with a machete and torturing cats. His actions appeared to be quite dangerous. During the trial, the defendant struggled to answer many questions, especially regarding why, in addition to Nadine, her friend Florian, brother Kevin, and her parents were killed. The lawyer argued that this showed Andreas lacked control over his actions and didn't fully grasp what was happening. However, the Austrian justice system made a definitive ruling: the murder of 5 people could not be seen as a mitigating factor. The idea that Andreas E. was insane was dismissed. By the end of the trial, he was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison. Nevertheless, this doesn't mean he will be incarcerated for life. In Austria, individuals with life sentences are often released after an average of 21 years. Furthermore, the lawyer vowed to continue advocating for his client's release and planned to file appeals. Hello everyone, today we will learn about another case. The case of Elizabeth Espino Vasquez. Elizabeth Vasquez Marin was born in a city located in the Cajamarca department of Peru. Her parents were 6 children. The parents loved them all dearly and worked incredibly hard to raise their children in prosperity. Elizabeth's childhood was happy and cheerful, as is often the case in a family with many children. She got along well with her 5 siblings. During her university studies, Elizabeth met a young man, Alejandro Espino, whom she married in 1987. A year later, they had their first and only daughter, whom they named Elizabeth Espino Vasquez, affectionately called Elita by everyone. By that time, both Elita's parents were balancing family life with their careers. Elizabeth began to develop her career as a lawyer, studying 2 majors simultaneously at university in Lima, while her husband was also working toward his career as a lawyer. Years later, his career advancement led him to the position of prosecutor in the fight against corruption. The hectic pace of life left them with almost no time to care for their little girl, who, during the first 4 years of her life, was raised by her grandparents on her mother's side. They provided her with the love that her parents could not, and additionally, Elita grandparents' youngest daughter was Elita's age, allowing them to grow up like sisters. Every birthday of Elita's was celebrated like a grand holiday and served as a wonderful reason for the whole family to gather. At every family event, Elita was always by her aunt's side. The 2 girls constantly played pranks together and were never scolded. Instead, they were spoiled and had their wishes fulfilled, which led to them being jokingly labeled as spoiled. When Elita turned 4, her parents decided, in her best interests, to move to the Lima department since it was time for her to start kindergarten and they wanted her to have access to quality education from an early age. Moreover, moving to the capital afforded Elita other privileges. To make up for the time she could not spend with her only daughter, her mother showered Elita with various gifts, leading her to live like a queen. She had the best toys, designer clothes, trips abroad, and a top-notch education. Additionally, Maureen indulged all her whims. Despite this, the little girl often felt out of place, unable to rely on her mother's company, who was busy managing several businesses. Nevertheless, Maureen tried to spend all her free time with Elita. Eventually, they grew so close that they resembled best friends. Unfortunately, this closeness vanished without a trace when Elita reached her teenage years. In an instant, she transformed into a problematic teen, and the first warning sign was her plummeting school performance, despite having always been the best student. Shortly thereafter, constant quarrels with her mother ensued. Elita's resentment began to fester because everyone around her admired her mother, specifically, her mother's success at work, beauty, and gentle demeanor. Elita did not possess the same physical attributes as her mother, which consumed her with strong jealousy. At every opportunity, she would question why she looked so different from her mother. In an attempt to reconnect with her daughter, Elizabeth continued to indulge her desires and shower her with gifts. Among these requests were plastic surgeries and other measures aimed at enhancing Alita's beauty. Elizabeth supported and financed these efforts in hopes that Alita's confidence and self-esteem would improve, but the girl remained unsatisfied. Her hatred for her mother only deepened. Elizabeth and Alejandro's divorce in 2007 only exacerbated the situation. Alita blamed her mother for it all, and her resentment intensified. Around the same time, Alita began dating a young man named Fernando González Asenjo, whom she met at a Mormon church in the San Isidro area. Few people knew that Fernando attended the church solely to exploit unsuspecting young believers with considerable money. His scheme was simple. He would tell wealthy young women that his family was very poor, that he lived alone with his mother, and that his father had abandoned the family when he was just a small boy. By pretending to be a good son, a victim, he evoked pity from the girls and gained their affection. Alita was no exception. In reality, Fernando was a problematic individual. He had no job, didn't even try to study, wanted an easy life. Fernando understood that Alita would easily succumb to manipulation and would support him, while Alita did not realize that Fernando was simply using her. When Elizabeth found out that her daughter was dating a young man from the church, she was happy because she thought he was a hardworking and good boy. Additionally, when Alita talked about the difficulties that Fernando had allegedly faced, Elizabeth decided to help him get his life on track. She rented him an inexpensive apartment so that he could live away from his mother and paid for his schooling, during which he was supposed to study business so that later, Maureen could offer him a job in one of her companies. However, Fernando did not take advantage of this opportunity and attended only 2 classes. When Elizabeth learned about this, she was very upset. Understanding that Fernando was dear to her daughter, she decided to give him another chance and offered him a job as a manager's assistant. Fernando missed that opportunity as well. He was fired after losing a check for a substantial amount of money, even though he was simply supposed to deliver it from one place to another. Furthermore, Fernando did not pay Elizabeth rent for the apartment, despite their agreement that she would let him live there for a minimum price, not for free. This behavior convinced Elizabeth that he was with Alita only for her money. She forbade her daughter from continuing the relationship, thinking she could break them apart. Maureen decided to send Alita to the United States for a vacation at her younger sister's house, with whom Alita had been very close in childhood. This decision turned out to be perfect. She hoped her daughter could meet other boys and forget about Fernando. Ultimately, this plan did not work, and the couple continued their long-distance relationship. Just a couple of months later, Alita returned to Lima to start studying at the law school of the Peruvian University of Applied Sciences. At the same time, Fernando moved to another apartment and began living alone, but he was able to afford this not because he found a job, but because Alita was paying all his bills. She received this money from her mother, who gave her about $450 a month for her university expenses. This amount, of course, was not enough for the lavish lifestyle Fernando hoped for. Therefore, to please her boyfriend, Alita snuck into her mother's room and stole her wallet. Elizabeth soon noticed the missing money, which led to a fierce argument between mother and daughter. Alita denied taking the money, but by that time, Elizabeth suspected that her daughter was still seeing Fernando, and the situation with the money helped confirm this. Intending to find out the truth, Elizabeth checked her daughter's computer. She found her correspondence with Fernando. In the messages, she also saw that Fernando was demanding rent payments, meals from expensive restaurants, and branded clothing from Alita. This situation was the last straw for Elizabeth. In turn, Alita interpreted this as a declaration of war. By July 2009, Elizabeth reduced the amount of money she gave her daughter for expenses and began to keep track of every penny she spent. Of course, all of this drove Alita to despair, as she could no longer indulge her boyfriend's desires. Alita's dissatisfaction grew. She wanted money, power, and freedom. She planned to achieve this at any cost, even ignoring the fact that Elizabeth was doing all of this for her sake. It was then that Alita decided to cross all boundaries and began to devise a plan to get rid of her own mother. Alita's plan was to inherit her mother's fortune, which was estimated at $4 million at that time. Additionally, Elizabeth had investments in the insurance market, owned several companies, and had several insurance policies, which Alida did not suspect. Little did she know that her mother was one step ahead in her efforts to protect her daughter from Fernando. She had rewritten her will, and in the event of her death, all her assets would go to Elizabeth's father, who would be obliged to take care of Alida. As if foreseeing what was about to happen, Elizabeth met with her parents, brothers, and sisters to inform them of her decision. She told them she was doing this for Alida, because she feared for her safety and her daughter's safety, having realized that Fernando was an unreliable person capable of causing harm for his own desires. Unfortunately, Maureen was not mistaken. While Elizabeth was doing everything possible for Alida's well-being, she was unhappy that Elizabeth did not accept her relationship with Fernando, and that Elizabeth had taken away some privileges. Alida planned to stage a kidnapping to escape with her boyfriend and use the money obtained to gain the freedom she so desperately wanted. Greed, envy, beauty, constant quarrels, the thirst for money, and Fernando's bad influence led Alida to devise a plan to murder her mother. Enlisting the help of her boyfriend Fernando and a friend of Fernando's named Jorge Cornejo Ruiz, who was 22 years old, to help them commit the crime that was to take place on the night of January 26, 2010. On that day, Alida went to work with Elizabeth and asked her for about $3 supposedly to print some university assignments. In fact, she spent that money to take a taxi home, let Fernando and his friend into their house. The guys hid in Elizabeth's room and were to wait for her return from work. Alida told them that when Elizabeth entered the room, they should immediately strangle Elizabeth as they had previously agreed. After talking to her accomplices, Alida returned to work with Elizabeth. Eventually, Alida and Elizabeth returned home around 10:30 p.m. Alida deliberately made a small noise so that Fernando and Jorge could hear. Unsuspecting, Elizabeth went up to her room and turned on the light. At that moment, Fernando, standing behind her, began to strangle Elizabeth while his accomplice Jorge held Elizabeth by her legs. Elizabeth managed to break free for a moment and resist, but Fernando quickly regained his footing, subdued her. When it was over, Alida went to the kitchen where the 19-year-old maid, Maria Liliana Huaman Chuculin, was at the time. She ordered Maria to go to her room and lock herself in there. After that, Alida returned to Elizabeth's room. While Fernando and Jorge held her down, Alida lunged at Elizabeth, began demanding money from her, forcing her to give the password to the accounts or hand over the safe's key. Until that moment, Elizabeth thought that Fernando was acting alone to take revenge on her, but upon seeing that her daughter was involved in the attack, she gathered her strength to lunge at Alida. Elizabeth managed to grab Alida by her arms and scratch her chest. When the fight was almost over, Elizabeth kicked her daughter several times in the legs. This last act enraged Alida, after which she struck her mother severely, pressed a pillow to her face to suffocate her. When Elizabeth stopped breathing, the criminals proceeded with their plan. Fernando and Jorge took the body, moved it to the trunk of Elizabeth's car. Meanwhile, Alida went to distract the guard. She talked to him and asked him to go to the pharmacy to buy some medicine. Thus, they managed to remove the body. They planned to hide it and the car to stage everything as if it were a kidnapping. The screams and sounds of the struggle were heard by the maid, which scared her greatly, but she could do nothing to help Elizabeth as Alida had locked her in and she had no way to escape the room on her own. Early in the morning at 5 a.m., Maria woke up and made orange juice for Elizabeth as she always did. At that time, Alida appeared and told her to drink the juice because her mother had already gone to work. After that, she went to her mother's workplace, where Elizabeth's accountant was already present. Alida told her that the criminals had contacted her and claimed that Elizabeth had been kidnapped. Elizabeth's accountant immediately blocked all of her boss's bank accounts to prevent the criminals from carrying out bank transfers. Jessica also noticed that Alida looked worried, that there were bruises on her arms and legs, but she did not pay much attention to it as at that moment she was only thinking about Elizabeth. She immediately reported the kidnapping to law enforcement while Alida called her relatives to tell them what had happened. When she returned to the office, she was shocked by the state of her workspace. there was chaos everywhere and many documents were scattered across the desk. At that moment, she did not notice that several important documents, including a will that Elizabeth claimed had been made a few months earlier, were missing. This will then caused a legal dispute between her relatives. While the police began investigating the disappearance from the tourist area, a horrifying message came in. An abandoned car had been found with a lifeless body inside. The body was taken to the morgue, where forensic experts conducted analyses and immediately established the cause of death as suffocation, discovering traces of violence on various parts of her body. The news of Elizabeth's death shocked her family and those around her. Everyone who knew and loved her could not believe that such a hardworking and kind woman could have been killed in such a terrible way. At the funeral, Alida appeared to be grief-stricken and inconsolable. In the following days, she displayed only cold behavior and a vacant gaze, as though she were not at all affected by her mother's death. Furthermore, she provided nonsensical explanations for what had happened that day. Her grandmother and grandfather felt that they no longer knew the girl they had raised, loved so much in her childhood. The investigation began by examining threats that Elizabeth's ex-husband had received a few months prior. He was a talented lawyer and at that time worked as a prosecutor fighting corruption. Investigators speculated that a possible reason for the disappearance could have been his significant role in the arrest of the mafia and a well-known banned substance dealer. He had powerful enemies, and their involvement seemed obvious, but the investigation in that direction led nowhere. The detectives assigned to the case then decided to focus on a person who could have been the organizer of the crime. By that time, enough evidence and conflicting witness statements had been gathered, indicating that the perpetrator could have been Alida, Elizabeth's only daughter. Despite her display of mourning at the funeral, the police had lingering suspicions, as during the interrogations, Alida provided contradictory stories. During her first interrogation, she stated that she had come home late in the evening and immediately gone to her room to study. At 2 a.m., she realized she was hungry and went down to the kitchen. When she returned, the door to her mother's room was locked, but the light was still on inside. Alida recounted that her mother had left for work early on the morning of January 27th, after which she received a call from the criminals informing her that her mother had been taken hostage and that they would release her in exchange for a ransom. Detectives managed to establish that this call never occurred. Instead, they discovered that on that day, Alida had made numerous calls to Fernando. Following this finding, they became the primary suspects in the case. When Alida was called back for questioning, she claimed that she had never argued with her mother, a statement confirmed by her father, who at the time was already a district judge and the chairman of the Supreme Court of Amazonas. He stated that their family was very close, even despite the divorce, and insisted that the reason for Elizabeth's death was revenge from her enemies, although this version had already been dismissed by authorities. Additionally, there was other evidence against Alida and Fernando. Although the criminals had wiped the fingerprints, a luminol test revealed that Elizabeth's blood had been found throughout the house. A crucial element in the investigation was the testimony of the maid, who described that terrible night, noting that she heard Elizabeth's cries for help but could not assist her because Alida had locked her in. She added that in the morning, she performed her household duties, but Alida came and said that her mother had already left for work. There is also the testimony of the guard. Later, Elizabeth's best friend testified that mother and daughter often had intense arguments, and sometimes Alida even attacked her mother. Considering all the gathered evidence and testimonies, on February 9th, the Homicide Investigation Department of the National Police of Peru appealed to the on-duty judge for the preliminary arrest of 3 suspects in this crime. Alida was arrested around noon. Just a couple of hours later, her accomplices, Fernando and Jorge, were also apprehended. During Alida's arrest, she was accompanied by her father, Alejandro Espino, and 2 defense attorneys. After Alida was placed in custody, she underwent a forensic examination, during which it was determined that she had injuries on her hands and feet that had occurred up to 10 days prior, around the time of the crime. After intensive interrogations, the first to admit responsibility was Fernando, followed by Jorge. Consequently, Alida felt she had no choice but to confess her guilt as well. Alida revealed that on the night of the maid, she distracted the guard, allowing her accomplices to break into Elizabeth's room. Furthermore, she stated that she cleaned up the crime scene and that it was Fernando who took Elizabeth's life. Alida did not conceal her motives, stating that she acted out of frustration with the imposed rules and the prohibitions on seeing her boyfriend. Meanwhile, the head of the forensic department emphasized the composure of the criminals, who confessed to committing their actions fully aware of the consequences and without being under the influence of alcohol or illegal substances. The criminals also revealed that they had planned to take Elizabeth's life several months prior when her relationship with Alida became unbearable. However, this was not the only motive. Another goal was to collect a life insurance policy worth $100,000. As new details of the case emerged and were covered in the media, public sentiment towards Alida deteriorated day by day, peaking when it became known that she was the one who initiated the crime that led to her mother's death. However, Alida's grandfather decided to visit his granddaughter in prison, hoping to hug and forgive her, as she was his blood. To his surprise, during one of these visits, Alida began to behave coldly towards him, insulting him, even telling him not to return. This occurred in March, 2 months after Elizabeth's death. Following this, he stated that Alida was now dead to him and immediately filed a lawsuit to exclude her from the inheritance due to her unworthy behavior, intending to prevent Alida from receiving her mother's inheritance. Consequently, a legal battle over the inheritance began between Alida and her family. Despite Elizabeth's relatives assuring that there was a will in favor of Alida's grandfather, this document, as previously mentioned, mysteriously disappeared from Elizabeth's office and from the city registrar's office. The accountant who worked with Elizabeth noted that the only person with access to Elizabeth's documents was her own daughter. By May of that same year, Alida initiated the process of the will from prison in an attempt to inherit her mother's estate, but she was unaware that she was not the only heir. Alejandro also filed a lawsuit, claiming that he and Elizabeth were not divorced but had merely decided to live separately and, in his opinion, he had the right to receive half of the estate as her widower. Liliana Vasquez Marin asserted that her sister and Alejandro divorced in 2007 with mutual consent and that both already had new partners. Alejandro's response was swift. He confirmed that they had indeed begun the divorce process but never finalized it, as they were concerned about their daughter and thought that finalizing the divorce might significantly impact her. Amid this inheritance dispute, another brother of Elizabeth intervened to assert that when they were handling the funeral, Alejandro was only interested in money. Additionally, he emphasized that it was too suspicious that two key documents in this case, the divorce certificate and the will in which his sister bequeathed all her property to their father, had gone missing. He also reported that Alida's father, taking advantage of his position and influence as a lawyer, publicly stated that his daughter would be sentenced to only 8 years in prison and would be released on parole after 3 years. Faced with these issues, the family lawyer provided the court with an executive document recognizing a foreign judgment, which stated that Elizabeth had divorced in the United States by mutual consent and that this document was valid in Peru. Over the next several months, Alida attempted to launch a campaign against her grandfather, choosing to slander him. She even dared to claim that he and one of her uncles were responsible for Elizabeth's death. The family was easily able to debunk these statements, asserting that Alida did this solely to harm her grandfather. Disappointment and grief gradually took a toll on his health and well-being, leading to his demise on December 27, 2011. He suffered a heart attack that resulted in his death. His remains were buried at the Campos Cemetery in Huapi, alongside those of his daughter, Elizabeth. After Alida's grandfather's death, the Vasquez family increased the number of lawsuits Alida to eliminate the possibility of them inheriting wealth. In the midst of the battles for inheritance, a lawsuit was simultaneously ongoing against Alida and her two accomplices for the death of Elizabeth. The first court hearing was scheduled for April 12 and was to take place in the 3rd Criminal Chamber for prisoners. However, the hearing was postponed until the 24th of that month after the court denied Alejandro's request to participate as a civil party in the process. When the time finally arrived for the first hearing, the suspects appeared in court dressed in black, with black nails, black pants, and a purple blouse. Alida attempted to appear calm, but her facade crumbled as soon as Ivan Melgar, the senior assistant prosecutor from the 9th prosecution of Lima, began mentioning more than 15 witnesses who would be called during the proceedings. Among these witnesses were Elizabeth's maid and the suspects, who were asked to testify about their state of mind the day before the crime was committed. The prosecution requested a repeated psychiatric evaluation for Alida after her defense requested to declare her innocent on the grounds that she had been suffering from bipolar disorder since 2007. During the debates, the deputy chief prosecutor officially filed for 30 years of imprisonment for her and the 2 other defendants, in addition to a payment of $27,000 as damages in civil proceedings. After the prosecution presented evidence, she pleaded not guilty and refused to claim any early dismissal or sentencing. On May 14, 2012, Fernando González Asenjo was sentenced to 28 years of imprisonment, and a week later, on May 21, Jorge Cornejo Ruiz received a similar sentence. While testifying, Alida accusing her former partner and his friend of planning, carrying out the attack on her mother. She also insisted that they had been hired by her uncle, who allegedly had connections to the illegal banned substance trade. This statement was supported by her father, who stated that the real criminals had exploited his daughter's mental illness to cause Elizabeth's death. Neither the victim's family nor the public believed this assertion. The trial took an unexpected turn when Fernando testified in court. During his testimony, he stated that he and Jorge had decided to commit the crime after Alida invited them to her home on January 26, 2010. Faced with this unexpected situation, the prosecution noted that Fernando's testimony contradicted his earlier statements made during the investigative phase, where he had claimed that he, Jorge, and Fernando had jointly planned the crime. Now, he had retracted his words. Given the circumstances, the prosecution announced that a confrontation would take place among the 3 suspects, mandated Jorge and Fernando to testify in court as witnesses. Eventually, Jorge provided testimony that Alida had offered him $20,000 not to speak about the events of that fateful night. Details also emerged regarding a plan devised by Fernando, in which the criminal group was supposed to go missing along with her mother, but Jorge asserted that he did not agree to be part of this plan. Jorge's lawyer noted that it was established that his client did not participate in either planning the events that led to Elizabeth's death or in carrying out the attack. Ultimately, Alida made a shocking statement, saying that she did not regret that Fernando killed her mother, claiming she had clearly seen it and did not want to take responsibility for what he did. The lawyer also assured that Fernando's statements were spontaneous and that he had received no bribes to change his original statement. The maid, Maria Liliana, also noted that Elizabeth was against her daughter's relationship with Fernando because Elizabeth considered him a slacker. She reiterated her previous statements regarding Alida's confession and Alejandro's threats. After these testimonies, the prosecution and oversight body requested a copy of her statements to initiate an investigation against Senior Judge Alejandro in connection with the alleged threats he made toward Maria. At the time the appeal was initiated, the court granted Alida's request to recognize her as the heir to her deceased grandfather's estate. This caused outrage in the Vasquez family, who filed an appeal against the aforementioned ruling. According to the family's lawyer, it was proven that the accused was involved in the events that led to her mother's death, and that was sufficient to strip her of any chance of inheriting property from their family. Even greater uncertainty in the judicial proceedings was introduced by 4 experts tasked with establishing the psychological profile of Alida. As they reached contradictory conclusions, 2 stated that she actually had bipolar disorder affecting her ability to think clearly, while the other 2 declared that the disorder altered her emotional capabilities but not her consciousness. Consequently, she was very well aware and understood what she was doing, and she was fully responsible for her actions. One of the psychologists provided the court with drawings by Alida and printed statistics indicating that she had an above-average IQ, which suggested that she could manipulate others. Based on the results of the psychological testing, the prosecution claimed that the bipolar disorder referred to by Alita's defense was not an illness but an emotional disorder. Therefore, she should be deemed sane and receive a strict punishment. At one of the final hearings, expert testimony was presented by the specialist who examined Elizabeth. He reported that the bloodstains found in Elizabeth's car suggested that she may have still been alive when she was placed there. During his closing arguments, the senior assistant prosecutor stated that at the time of the crime, the accused was not suffering from bipolar disorder, was stable, and most likely had carefully planned everything in advance. After countless attempts by Alita, Elizabeth Espino Vasquez, to distort what happened and deny the truth, on December 24, 2012, she was found guilty of murdering her mother, Elizabeth Vasquez Marin, and was sentenced to 30 years in prison. While the judge read the sentence, she pulled out an icon and, with tears in her eyes, began to pray, tearfully declaring that the sentence was unfair. For several minutes, she spoke with her lawyer, who stated that he would appeal the verdict. The lawyer continued to insist that various clinical and psychological analyses conducted by renowned specialists showed that Alita suffered from an emotional affective disorder, and this should be taken into account during the review of the sentence. By that time, Alita was still listed as a potential heir to her grandfather's and mother's estates, was therefore continuing to process the necessary documentation to inherit them. In light of this, the Vasquez family demanded that the Fifth World Court make a ruling on the matter, as the procedure had been halted in 2011. However, over the next 8 years, all attempts by the Vasquez family to obtain a judicial decision on this matter were unsuccessful. On January 21, 2021, Alita received news of her father Alejandro's death from natural causes. To this day, legal proceedings regarding whether the Vasquez family can exclude Alita from the list of heirs are ongoing. The entire Vasquez family has stated that this situation has been a true torment for them. This case shook all of Peru, revealing that there are people who, in pursuit of their goals, do not hesitate to eliminate anyone who stands in their way, even their own mother. Hello again, true crime fans. We've got another mysterious case to explore. The case of Mindy Berenyi. Mindy Berenyi grew up in a small farming town in Antwerp, Ohio, in a middle-class family. Her mother, Shirley, met her future husband, Andy, while she was still in school. At the time, Andy was 18 and had completed his auto mechanic training, while Shirley was 17 and still in high school. Their relationship progressed quickly, and they married just a few months after meeting. Shortly after their marriage, Shirley discovered that she was pregnant by another man she had dated before meeting Andy. She had not been unfaithful to Andy, it was simply the result of a previous relationship. Shirley hesitated for a long time, but eventually, Andy accepted both her and the baby as his family. The couple stayed together for 15 years and had 3 children during their marriage. 2 of the children were Andy's, while the eldest was from Shirley's previous relationship. However, after 15 years of marriage, they decided to divorce. Shirley, feeling she could no longer cope as a single mother, gave up custody of all 3 children. The children went to live with Andy, their father. Mindy always loved her father. However, disturbing changes began to disrupt her life. When Mindy was about 9 years old, her father called her into his bedroom and asked her to give him a massage. Years later, Mindy realized this was the beginning of the abuse. At the time, she did not fully understand what was happening and complied, even though she felt something was wrong. She later recalled that it did not feel like a normal massage. Eventually, Mindy refused to go to her father's bedroom. From that point on, Andy's treatment of her became much harsher. Andy began to manipulate his children emotionally, insulting them and even resorting to physical violence. This caused Mindy's brothers to leave the house. Andy eventually remarried, which seemed to improve the strained family relationships, but nothing truly changed. He continued to exert tight control over Mindy, especially as she grew older. Like any teenager, Mindy wanted to spend time with her friends, but her father would not allow it. His behavior became increasingly controlling and manipulative. When Mindy got a job at a nearby McDonald's, Andy kept a close eye on her. He tracked the mileage on his car when she drove, frequently searched her room, and even recorded and listened to Mindy's phone conversations. When Andy was away from home, he turned off his phone to prevent his daughter from communicating with anyone without his supervision. She wanted to stay in touch with her friends and live like a normal teenager, but this angered her father. He would eavesdrop on Mindy's conversations and immediately disconnect her phone from the network if he heard something he disliked. He demanded complete obedience from her, but Mindy refused to comply. When Mindy turned 16, Andy's behavior became increasingly dangerous. He would grab and strangle her when she resisted his control. He would throw her around and beat her while trying to avoid leaving any evidence. The situation worsened when Andy discovered she was pregnant, although the identity of the father was unknown. Mindy was devastated, unable to imagine raising a child in such a hostile environment. Her father's abusive behavior had become unbearable, and she feared for her life and well-being. That same day, Mindy stormed into Andy's upstairs bedroom and grabbed a shotgun hanging on the wall. She then ran into the bathroom, intending to take her own life. Andy was not home at the time, but by the time Mindy changed her mind and decided to put the shotgun away to avoid her father's detection, it was too late. When Andy walked in and saw his daughter holding the gun, he immediately flew into a rage. Mindy later said she was terrified and thought she was in serious trouble. Andy turned away to close the door, saying he would deal with her right away. Moments later, a gunshot rang out. At approximately 4:16 p.m. on September 27th, Joni, Andy's second wife, called the police. When police arrived at the scene, they found Andy lying on the floor. Mindy claimed that she had acted in self-defense. According to Mindy, she had endured years of abuse, along with constant psychological pressure and total control from her abusive father, Andy, who would punish her for even the smallest mistakes. In an attempt to defend herself, she accidentally shot and killed her father. Lawyers accepted her testimony and planned to fight for her acquittal. However, a significant challenge was that Mindy rarely spoke about her struggles or the abuse she endured. Her father, Andy, had restricted her interactions with others, only allowing her to communicate with others when he was supervised. As a result, she had no opportunity to confide in her friends or anyone else about her situation. Additionally, there were no bruises or injuries on her body. This lack of evidence created serious obstacles to convincing the jury that this was indeed a case of self-defense. Shirley, Mindy's mother, supported her daughter's testimony. Mindy had repeatedly complained about her father's abusive behavior, but Shirley had dismissed each time as isolated incidents. Mindy would then reassure her mother that everything was fine, leading her to believe that her daughter was exaggerating. Now, Mindy claimed that her father had threatened her, and Shirley admitted that Andy had behaved similarly throughout their marriage. While at the police station, Shirley revealed that she had also suffered abusive behavior from her husband, which was the main reason for their divorce. However, she did not expect that Andy would use the same tactics on their daughter. The situation became even more complicated when Mindy faced information isolation. She was unable to socialize comfortably with others and could only occasionally spend a few minutes on the phone without Andy's supervision. Despite everything, Shirley supported her daughter. Andy's second wife, Joni, who had been married to him for 8 years, defended him. She described Andy as a loving husband and devoted father, raising 2 sons and doing his best for his ungrateful daughter, Mindy. She saw him as a decent man who was unfairly labeled a tyrant to justify the murder. According to Joni, Andy spent much of his free time with his children, often taking them to the nearby river to fish and boat. This account was supported by all of Andy's neighbors. Joni described her husband as a hardworking man who devoted his life to his family. Andy's relatives were steadfast in their support of him, insisting that he was never cruel or manipulative. From the beginning, they described Mindy as an insecure and disobedient child whose negative traits worsened as she grew older. They portrayed her as a pathological liar and a rebellious individual who frequently tried to run away from home and even stole her father's car several times. Andy also suspects that she may be using illegal substances. Concerned about her behavior, he believes that strict rules need to be put in place to deal with the situation. Andy's relatives claim that this was not an act of self-defense, but rather a brutal and calculated murder by Mindy. They allege that she killed her father, a man who did everything in his power to keep his daughter out of trouble. Joni reported that Andy had blocked Mindy's phone. This was because Mindy had been calling her friends frequently, often planning to run away. He later discovered that Mindy had been skipping work, which led him to periodically check her car's mileage to ensure she did not lose her job at McDonald's. Andy also began searching her room after suspecting that she was smoking. Based on these actions, Andy's behavior appeared consistent with that of a controlling yet concerned parent. In the months leading up to the murder, Joni kept a diary documenting many of Mindy's disturbing behaviors. Mindy was described as a rule breaker. Joni's diary recorded every attempt Mindy made to run away, which had happened 3 times in the past 2 months. The diary also described how Mindy spent days lying in bed, drinking, and being dishonest. Because of this behavior, her loved ones found it impossible to trust her. According to Joni, Mindy's behavior was so out of control that Joni feared for her own safety. She overheard Mindy say things to her father that made her feel extremely insecure. This behavior continued for years. According to Joni, Andy only lost his temper once. On that occasion, he grabbed Mindy by the neck and pushed her against a wall. However, it was clear that he had no intention of harming her. Joni categorically denied that there was any abuse toward Mindy. She also stated that she never heard Andy insult his daughter, call her worthless, emotionally pressure her, or humiliate her, as Mindy had described. Joni was home when Andy died. She noticed that Mindy was acting strangely throughout the day but did not think much of it. Everything changed when Joni heard a loud bang. She immediately ran downstairs and saw Mindy pointing a gun at her. Joni quickly retrieved the gun, and no one was hurt. At first, she thought Mindy was just trying to get attention. However, when she went into the kitchen, Joni saw Andy lying on the floor near the entrance through the open door. She called out to him, but he did not respond. When she got closer, she realized he was dead. Mindy killed her father, whom she had hated for years, seemingly without any particular reason. Joni claimed that Andy had always tried to support and protect Mindy from the hardships of life. When the police arrived at the scene, they arrested Mindy and took her to the sheriff's office, where she tearfully confessed to the murder. At the police station, Joni stated that the act was intentional. She believed Mindy was manipulative and untrustworthy. The lawyers sought to damage Andy's reputation, as it was the only way to prove Mindy's innocence. From the beginning, Joni believed that Mindy was trying to deceive everyone to avoid responsibility for her terrible crime. However, the lawyers argued that Mindy had suffered years of emotional and physical abuse and only acted in self-defense when she felt her life and the life of her unborn child was in danger. Mindy, who had recently found out she was pregnant, was terrified, believing that her father would kill her if he found out. Mindy's strongest supporter remained her mother, Shirley. The prosecution presented a wealth of evidence, including a poem found in Mindy's notebook, which had been discovered in her nightstand. The poem described the murder and was accompanied by a small drawing of a bleeding heart being stabbed with a knife. According to the prosecution, this suggested that Mindy had carefully planned the crime. The prosecution argued that when Mindy took the weapon from her father's room, she did not intend to kill herself. Instead, they claimed that she had taken the weapon and ambushed her father. Forensic scientists determined that Andy had been shot in the back with a shotgun, refuting the claim that he had attacked first. He could not have attacked with his back turned. A neighbor testified on behalf of the prosecution, stating that he was about 40 yards from the house when Andy opened the door. The neighbor said everything was quiet, and he did not hear Andy swearing or making threats, contrary to Mindy's claim. According to the neighbor, Andy simply walked into the house, and 10 seconds later, gunshots rang out. The defense attorneys argued that Mindy had been overwhelmed and scared for her life, and that she had acted in self-defense as she prepared to become a mother at a young age. The defense presented a key witness, Mindy's mother, Shirley, who described Andy as a cruel and abusive manipulator who had mistreated her and her older sons. Shirley explained that Andy would force the family to sit at the kitchen table for hours, humiliating and insulting them while clearly enjoying their discomfort. She noted that throughout their marriage, Mindy had been spared from these attacks only because she was so young at the time. However, after Shirley left, Andy's anger turned toward his daughter. Things changed when Mindy turned 15 and called Shirley for the first time, saying she could no longer tolerate Andy's bullying behavior. During this time, Mindy's mental state became extremely concerning. She was admitted to a clinic, where she was diagnosed with depression and had attempted suicide. She stayed there for 9 days, was given medication, and was discharged after her condition was deemed stable. However, her father's pressure and abuse continued. According to Mindy, this caused her to develop paranoia. She felt trapped, like a prisoner in her own home, unable to escape her overbearing father. To cope with her fear and pain, she began drinking and smoking marijuana. This behavior eventually attracted the attention of social services. However, it was Andy who contacted them, hoping to address what he described as Mindy's disturbing behavior. Andy was surprised when Laura Alvarado, a child abuse investigator, sided with Mindy after speaking with her. Laura believed that Mindy was not being defiant or out of control. Instead, it appeared that the teenager was feeling anxious and threatened at home. Mindy had pleaded for help, even expressing a desire to move into a foster home to escape her father. She also revealed that her mother had refused to take her in, unwilling to intervene because of the custody agreement. To Laura, this seemed less like the behavior of a rebellious teenager and more like a child who felt trapped and hopeless. Laura had several conversations with Mindy, but during their last meeting, something seemed different and more troubling. Mindy appeared closed off and unwilling to open up. Laura suspected that Andy had threatened her, but further investigation revealed no solid evidence. The most anticipated part of the hearing was Mindy's testimony in her own defense. This was a high-risk strategy, as it could either persuade the jury to sympathize with her or push them in the opposite direction. The outcome depended entirely on whether the jury believed her. Initially, Mindy's attorney decided to take the gamble, arguing that only Mindy could prove who was telling the truth and who was lying. However, the odds were clearly against her. Ultimately, the defense counsel advised taking a safer route. Mindy agreed to a plea bargain, which resulted in a reduced sentence of 20 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 10 years. Soon after, the situation changed. At age 20, Mindy had already served 4 years in prison and was now focused on seeking justice and regaining her freedom. During this time, the legal system had recognized mental distress as a valid defense, even in murder cases. This change provided a new perspective for Mindy's attorney. An appeal was filed and eventually accepted. However, the appeal came with significant risks. If the jury rejected Mindy's testimony, she could face life in prison, with a minimum of 33 years before she could apply for early release. Despite the high stakes, Mindy was determined to fight to clear her name. Both the prosecution and defense returned to present their cases, as they had during the first trial. Andy's wife, Joni, continued to grieve the loss of her husband and remained determined to prove that Mindy was responsible. At trial, Mindy recounted her traumatic experiences of enduring years of physical abuse at the hands of Andy. She described how he threatened her daily, constantly demeaning and humiliating her for seemingly trivial reasons. Desperate to avoid her father, she tried to limit contact, but living in the same house made that nearly impossible. Even brief encounters often escalated into conflicts and confrontations. The prosecutor's office repeated the arguments they had made during the first hearing. Mindy explained that she had chosen the bathroom to end her life, but she hesitated and was unable to go through with it. She discovered she was pregnant and felt a sense of responsibility for her unborn child. For an hour, she struggled with whether to live or die until she heard her father return home. At that moment, she realized she had lost the chance to return the gun to his room without being discovered. Mindy knew her father would be furious if he found out about her plan. Overcome with fear and emotional distress, she decided to protect herself and her child at all costs. Mindy also explained why she shot her father in the back. She said she had told him to check his answering machine, hoping to distract him while she quietly returned the gun to his room. But as she walked into the kitchen, she saw him begin to turn around and noticed the shotgun. Panicked and believing he was about to lunge at her, she pulled the trigger. The jury heard conflicting accounts. Andy's wife, Joni, and a nearby neighbor claimed there were no signs of a struggle or any screams for help, further suggesting that the killing was premeditated rather than an act of self-defense. At the hearing, an anonymous source revealed that a juror was biased. The juror had traveled from another state, motivated by Mindy's story. As a result, a new hearing was scheduled with a different jury. This time, the defense presented a new witness, Mindy's treating physician during her first hospitalization for depression and end-life thoughts. The physician confirmed that Mindy was severely depressed and exhibited clear signs of post-traumatic stress disorder. She would flinch at the sound of any noise or footsteps. The psychiatrist supported Mindy's testimony that she had been humiliated and tortured by her father. Under the circumstances, her actions in self-defense seemed understandable, especially as she feared for her life and the safety of her child. Both sides presented strong arguments. However, the prosecutor's office held back a critical move. They introduced their own psychiatrist, who strongly disagreed with the conclusions of Mindy's treating doctor. Mindy faced a significant setback when her brother disputed claims of domestic violence in the home, allegations often made by both her mother and Mindy. Ultimately, after 24 hours of deliberation, the jury found Mindy Bereniite guilty of murdering her father. She was sentenced to life in prison, with the possibility of parole after 23 years. Mindy's lawyers were shocked by the outcome, as they had not anticipated such a harsh sentence. The fate of Mindy's child remains unknown. In an earlier interview, Mindy admitted she knew her actions were wrong but insisted that desperation and fear drove her to kill her father, whom she described as a tyrant. Hello again, true crime fans. we've got another mysterious case to explore. The case of Graziella Monsi. The Monsi family had an 8-year-old daughter named Graziella Monsi, their only child and a long-awaited member of the family. They are businessmen who cater to tourists and have owned a shop for about 10 years where they sell nuts and dried fruits on the street leading to Castel del Monte. Their shop's prime location brought them steady and substantial income. Despite her young age, Graziella often helped her parents with the business, which made the family proud. Since childhood, she had been involved in their work, bringing energy and enthusiasm to the shop. The location was a bustling tourist area with a constant flow of customers, and her help was invaluable during busy times. Her cheerful and active nature left a lasting impression on customers who shopped there. One Saturday, a peak day for tourists, the Monsi family was hard at work, as weekends were typically their busiest. Graziella's grandfather often helped behind the counter during such busy periods, and she eagerly accompanied him to run small errands. That day, a large number of people came to Castel del Monte, keeping her grandfather busy at the stall, unable to step away. By evening, he grew tired and asked Graziella to go to the nearby fountain to fill a bottle with water. She happily agreed and left for the fountain, just a 5-minute walk away. However, her grandfather soon began to worry when she didn't return promptly. Graziella's grandfather comforted himself by thinking she might have met someone she knew and gotten distracted. However, after more than 20 minutes had passed and she still hadn't returned, he realized something was wrong. Worried, he walked to the fountain to check what might have delayed her. He was astonished to find Graziella nowhere to be seen, either on the road or near the fountain. He searched all the nearby streets carefully but couldn't locate her. Her disappearance seemed suspicious. The grandfather went back to the shop, hoping she might have returned through a different route, but she wasn't there. Roughly half an hour after she vanished, he informed her parents. Together, they began calling her friends and acquaintances, hoping someone had seen her. Sadly, no one they contacted had any information. Meanwhile, Monsi's entire family and some close friends gathered at the square near the store and began organizing a search. Less than an hour after Graziella vanished, the adults and teenagers divided into groups to search for her. The commotion caught the attention of passers-by and some tourists, prompting several volunteers to join the search effort. The Monsi family carried a photo of Graziella, asking anyone they encountered if they had seen her. A few people mentioned seeing a girl who looked like her earlier in the afternoon, but nobody knew where she might be or what had happened. The area was typically peaceful and quiet, making it hard to imagine someone attacking a girl in such a bustling location. After searching unsuccessfully for a few hours, the Monsi family reported Graziella missing at the local police station. The police acted quickly, and soon, the Carabinieri were involved in the search. Later, a witness approached an officer with a disturbing claim. He had heard a child's panicked cry coming from the wooded area near Castel del Monte. 2 police officers immediately went to investigate the location. When they arrived at the forest, they saw smoke rising from a fire. At first, they didn't think it was connected to Graziella's disappearance, but they decided to investigate to better understand the situation. Suspecting it might be a forest fire, they approached cautiously. As they got closer, about 10 meters away, they were hit by a distinct and horrifying smell: burnt flesh. Soon, the officers discovered a fire pit in the woods. In the flames, there were dry leaves burning, and underneath was what looked like a human body. To their horror, the body was child-sized, and the clothing matched the description of the dress Graziella had been wearing that day. The police immediately suspected the remains were hers. The fire had completely consumed her body, and she was found deceased. The area was thoroughly searched, but apart from fragments of Graziella's clothing in a lighter, likely used to start the fire, no other evidence was found to identify the perpetrator. Investigators decided to conduct a more thorough investigation of the area and aimed to collect surveillance footage from nearby cameras. A forensic expert later confirmed the grim discovery: the body was indeed Graziella's. An autopsy revealed that she had been deliberately murdered and burned. News of the incident spread quickly, making headlines the next day. Journalists flocked to Graziella's family, seeking comments on the tragic murder. When her relatives learned the full details of what had happened, they were in utter disbelief. They could not comprehend such a cruel and monstrous act. The entire community was deeply shaken. The media heightened public fear by extensively reporting on the horrific crime near the famous castle. This caused a sharp decline in tourist visits to the town, as people began to view the area as unsafe. The town's reputation as a popular destination suffered greatly, dealing a heavy blow to Andria's tourism industry. People are facing the tragedy and its lasting consequences. Meanwhile, investigators acted swiftly to find the perpetrator. From the very beginning, the police were determined to solve the case. Their primary theory was that a predator had enticed Graziella to leave the bustling tourist area and go to a more secluded location. There, he assaulted her and tried to cover up all evidence of the crime. Authorities initially believed that the attacker was likely an older, calculated, and experienced man. They began their investigation by reviewing a list of known criminals in the area who had criminal records related to abuse. However, as the case unfolded, this theory lost credibility. Investigators also considered the possibility that the perpetrator was a tourist who randomly targeted victims, including Graziella. To explore this, they analyzed tourist movements, but this idea also seemed increasingly improbable over time. As police interviewed witnesses, friends, and acquaintances of the Graziella family, one name kept coming up: Pasquale Tortora. He was a 20-year-old local man who worked illegally as a parking attendant on the same street as the Graziella family shop. Many people had noticed that since Graziella started working at the store, Pasquale had been observing her in a strange and unsettling way. Several individuals mentioned this, and their observations raised suspicions. When the police questioned Pasquale's friends, the concerns deepened. Some of his acquaintances had even joked that he seemed attracted to the 8-year-old girl. However, in the current situation, what had once been considered a harmless joke now carried a much darker implication. Could Pasquale have been a predator obsessed with Graziella? His family firmly denied this possibility, pointing out that he was raised in a respectable household and had no prior trouble with the law, at least, not until the tragic evening near Castel del Monte. However, despite his family's claims, Pasquale quickly became the main suspect. Investigators grew more suspicious after meeting with him. His t-shirt showed suspicious dark red stains, and his clothing was marked with dirt, as if he had been crawling or struggling on the ground. Additionally, his face bore small but clear scratches, resembling marks left by tiny hands in a desperate struggle. Pasquale, of course, denied any involvement in the attack on Graziella. However, during questioning by detectives, his testimony became increasingly inconsistent. He kept changing his story, which led investigators to suspect that he was hiding something. After just a few hours at the police station, Pasquale began to crumble under pressure. He then made a cold remark, stating that he found Graziella very beautiful, even though she was only 8 years old. Initially, he claimed that while walking in the woods, he stumbled upon Graziella's lifeless body already on fire. Frightened, he said he ran away, and the police showed up later. Later, he altered his story. He said he had seen Graziella heading to the fountain to fetch water. Since she knew him and trusted him, she wasn't afraid when he approached her. He emphasized that he had always acted calmly around her up to that point. Pasquale then mentioned that a dog had recently given birth to puppies in the nearby forest and claimed he had offered to show them to Graziella. This seemingly harmless excuse was the moment investigators grasped the horrifying reality of what had taken place. After breaking down completely, Pasquale confessed to his actions. He admitted to luring Graziella into the forest and, after committing the crime, setting her on fire to destroy any evidence. However, he denied intending to abuse her. Instead, he claimed his actions were part of a so-called Kato game, which had escalated beyond his control. The media quickly sensationalized the story, amplifying it with rumors and disturbing details. This overwhelming wave of coverage fueled public confusion. The true motive behind the murder remained unclear, as Pasquale's testimony was riddled with contradictions, leaving many questions unanswered. The police uncovered several inconsistencies in his account. His timeline didn't add up, and his explanations lacked credibility. One fact, however, was undeniable. The fire began around 10 p.m., but Graziella had already been missing for nearly 3 hours. So, what happened during that time frame? Later, Pasquale disclosed a chilling detail. He lit the fire after hearing people nearby in the forest. Believing they were searching for Graziella, he panicked and acted out of fear. However, the most horrifying discovery came from forensic experts. They concluded that she was still alive when the fire was set. Investigators continued to intensify their questioning of Pasquale. A troubling question emerged: how had he managed to commit such a horrific act while escaping with only minor injuries? Could he truly have acted alone? This led authorities to consider the possibility of an accomplice or even multiple accomplices, turning the focus of the investigation in a new direction. The police decided to interrogate Pasquale again. Eventually, he agreed to cooperate, admitting that fear had previously stopped him from revealing the entire truth. In his revised statement, Pasquale claimed that he never intended to harm Graziella himself. Instead, he stated that a group of young men, all aged 18 to 20, had coerced him. Pasquale identified 4 individuals: Michele Zagaria, Giuseppe Di Bari, Domenico Margiotta, and Vincenzo Corritella. He alleged that this group was waiting in the forest. According to him, there was no plan to harm or assault Graziella, but he had lost a bet with them. As a result, they pressured him to lure her into the woods. Pasquale recounted that when Graziella arrived in the forest, the 4 young men attacked her. They stopped her from escaping and forced her into silence. When they heard adults searching for her, they panicked. Fearing legal consequences, they decided to get rid of her. However, they didn't have any fuel to start a fire. Growing desperate, they tried to set her clothes on fire but failed. At one point, Graziella regained consciousness and screamed, prompting them to beat her again until she passed out. They tried to start the fire again, this time covering her body with leaves and using a lighter. The flames finally caught. All 4 young men came from respected families and had no history of violent behavior or serious crimes. Those who knew them described them as calm and well-mannered. Only one of them had a criminal record for a minor theft. Despite Pasquale's testimony, the idea that these 4 young men had decided to burn Graziella alive seemed unimaginable. However, once Pasquale provided their names, the police swiftly arrested them. News of their arrest shocked Italy, with the media covering every detail and fueling public outrage. From the beginning, the 4 suspects denied any involvement in Graziella's death. They claimed they had no idea why they were under investigation. Still, detectives remained determined to interrogate them until they uncovered the full truth about what happened that night. Unlike Pasquale, there was no physical evidence connecting the 4 men to the crime. When police searched their homes, nothing incriminating was found. They did acknowledge that Pasquale had an unhealthy obsession with Graziella, but they strongly denied having any part in her murder. Despite lengthy interrogations, none of the suspects admitted to any involvement. With no solid evidence against them, they were released but remained under close surveillance as the primary suspects. In a chilling development, the same 4 young men were later seen carrying Graziella's coffin at her funeral. Pasquale revealed that they were crying, appearing to be deeply affected by the loss. While detained, the young men claimed they were devastated because they recognized the young girl, often seeing her in the Monsi family's shop, even though they never spoke to her. The police suspected that their presence at the funeral was not coincidental. Although their connection to Graziella's family was minimal, they might have been burdened by guilt and sought some form of redemption. Alternatively, they might have been attempting to monitor the investigation into their possible involvement in the crime. During the next round of interrogations, the suspects were questioned separately. Vincenzo and Giuseppe claimed they had an alibi, supported by the testimony of young Luda. They stated that they had been at the city's gaming club on the day Graziella disappeared. Meanwhile, Michelle and Domenico refused to cooperate with the investigation, declined to answer questions, and demanded lawyers, which only heightened police suspicion. The detectives proceeded to verify Vincenzo and Giuseppe's alibi by visiting the gaming club. While their presence at the club was confirmed, they left after about an hour and were unable to account for their whereabouts afterward. As a result, investigators couldn't rule out their involvement in Graziella's torture. Unexpectedly, Michelle and Domenico confessed to the crime, largely corroborating Pasquale's account. According to their confession, the group invited them to the forest that evening, saying they wanted to play with fire. When Michelle and Domenico arrived, the others were already present. Pasquale was assigned to lure a victim and chose Graziella, a girl who, according to their friends, made him feel uneasy but seemed like an easy target. Pasquale later confirmed that he had discovered Graziella by the fountain while she was fetching water. He lured her by inviting her to see puppies that had recently been born in the nearby forest. Graziella, trusting and unsuspecting, did not imagine that this could lead to harm and agreed out of curiosity. Pasquale deceived and coaxed Graziella into following him. Since Graziella loved animals, she was eager to see the puppies, especially because Pasquale was someone she knew and trusted. She never expected such a cruel betrayal. The wooded area where the ambush was planned was nearby, about a 15 to 20-minute walk from where he first approached her. By then, her grandfather would have already begun searching for her. When they reached the location, Michelle, Giuseppe, Domenico, and Vincenzo jumped out from their hiding spots. Graziella was terrified. In that moment, she likely realized she had been trapped, but it was too late. She had no way to defend herself. While mildly intoxicated, the perpetrators continued drinking and seemed to take amusement in Graziella's fear. According to their later confessions, they claimed they didn't plan to assault her but merely wanted to torment and mock her, taking advantage of her vulnerability. Graziella was so frightened that she went into a state of shock. During the incident, their group accidentally caused Graziella to fall and hit her head against a stone. Initially, the group claimed they did not plan to imprison her. Their intention was to restrain her to scare her further, but she collapsed and lost consciousness. Believing she was dead, they panicked, fearing that she was already being searched for. Likely due to alcohol intoxication clouding their judgment, they decided to destroy all evidence of what had occurred. They thought setting a fire would accomplish this. Some claims by the suspects were partially supported by evidence. For instance, the forensic examination did not conclusively reveal any signs of abuse. Graziella was discovered wearing underwear. The condition of the remains was poor due to severe burns, which made it impossible to confirm or rule out abuse. The Carabinieri suspected that fire might have destroyed evidence, as hoped by the group. At the time, Michelle, Giuseppe, Domenico, and Vincenzo continued to insist that the incident had been accidental. The court finally decided the fate of the juvenile offenders. Vincenzo and Giuseppe confessed that they had gone to the forest because Pasquale invited them, unaware of what playing with fire meant. They claimed they were unwittingly drawn into something far more sinister. According to their testimony, they were horrified by what transpired and quickly left, not wanting to remain at the scene. However, they failed to realize that this dangerous situation would ultimately lead to police intervention. Their actions were driven by fear, either of the other participants or of the legal consequences they could face if accused of taking part. Despite inconsistencies in the group's accounts, the trial concluded with Pasquale Tortora receiving the lightest sentence, 30 years in prison. This was due to two key factors. First, he was the only member who cooperated voluntarily with the investigation. Second, despite extensive tests conducted by investigators, the evidence consistently showed that Pasquale was not the one who set Graziella's body on fire, although he actively participated in the abuse. Investigators concluded that the four criminals, Michelle, Giuseppe, Domenico, and Vincenzo, were responsible for dumping the body, and they imposed severe punishment on them. Convicted of kidnapping, child abuse, and premeditated murder, they received life sentences in solitary confinement. This meant they would remain in prison for the rest of their lives without interaction with other inmates. During the reading of the verdict, Graziella's mother fainted and had to be assisted by her husband. At the same time, tensions erupted among the defendants' families, resulting in arguments. Graziella's relatives expressed satisfaction with the sentences, believing them to be justified, except in the case of Pasquale, who they felt had been punished too lightly for luring their child into the woods and sealing her tragic fate. The court's severe ruling angered Vincenzo and Giuseppe, both of whom maintained their innocence adamantly. Their fervent claims gained them some supporters who believed their protestations, but this did not lead to a successful appeal. 8 years later, Vincenzo Corritella, 27, ended his life, possibly out of despair or guilt over his actions. While in prison, he discreetly brought a rope cord into his cell and used it to end his life. Just days prior, his mother had visited him and continued to firmly believe in his innocence. However, he had already lost hope. On June 19, 2013, Michel's lawyer requested a retrial, citing alleged judicial errors in opposing the verdict. The court, however, denied the request. Pasquale's mother publicly apologized to the Monsi family for her son's actions, expressing her belief that he should fully face the consequences of his crime. Despite this, Graziella's mother rejected the apology. She responded firmly, stating that Pasquale should experience the same pain their daughter had endured. She held the belief that if he had not led Graziella into the forest, their daughter would still be alive. As a result, Graziella's parents primarily blamed Pasquale for their loss. Graziella Monsi's name remains etched in memory across Italy. Near Castel del Monte, a small tombstone commemorates her, featuring her name, photograph, and a brief account of her tragically short life. Locals and tourists often leave flowers and toys at the site, though it is most frequently visited by Graziella's close family and friends. 24 years after the tragedy, Pasquale Tortora was released from prison. His original sentence was reduced by 6 years due to good behavior. Now 44 years old, he is attempting to rebuild his life, though it is uncertain whether he will succeed. Among the group involved in the crime, Pasquale was the only one tried through an abbreviated process, which led to a lighter punishment. Following the incident, the boys who were involved severed ties with each other. Their relationships remained fractured, even after Pasquale's release. He has expressed deep regret, stating that not a day passes without him reflecting on the harm he caused to Graziella and her family. Pasquale admits that, if given the chance to turn back time, he would never have committed the crime. Throughout his ordeal, his family provided crucial support, helping him endure that dark period and rebuild his life, a kindness for which he remains deeply grateful. Dasha, Graziella's mother, strongly objected to Pasquale's early release, claiming that it weakened the integrity of the law. She believes that individuals like him remain dangerous to society, are incapable of change, and should not be given second chances. Vincenzo and Giuseppe, both maintaining their innocence, questioned why Pasquale acted as he did. Vincenzo tragically died, leaving behind a suicide note in which he insisted on his innocence and expressed anger at the injustice he had endured. He entrusted evidence to a trusted person to support his claims in the future but lost the will to continue fighting for his freedom. Giuseppe, Domenico, and Michel remain isolated. Giuseppe continues to proclaim his innocence, spending his days reading the Bible. He has accepted his sentence and is not pursuing an appeal but firmly believes he will eventually be released when his complete lack of involvement in the murder is proven. His lawyer and family share this belief, as did the late Vincenzo. All three insist that Pasquale masterminded the tragedy. They assert that he lured Graziella into the forest, tortured her, and was solely responsible for the crime. Their claims are backed by evidence. Only Pasquale's body showed signs of a struggle, such as scratches inflicted by Graziella. His clothes had dirt and her blood on them, while the others had no such traces. Despite this, Pasquale received the lightest sentence and has been released. Hello everyone, today we will learn about another case. The case of Pamela Vitali. Pamela Vitali was born on January 11, 1953, at Shepherd Field Air Force Base in Wichita Falls, Texas, to U.S. Air Force Sergeant Vern B. Ludke, an accomplished pianist, and Carol J. Crowley Ludke, a vocalist and artist. Pamela spent most of her life in Minneapolis, Minnesota, with her family, including her sister Tamara. In her later years, Pamela worked as a flight attendant and visited various countries around the world. She met her first husband, Mario Vitali, in London, and then moved in with him. They had 2 children, Mario A. Vitali and Marissa A. Vitali. Despite appearances, their relationship was not the best from the very beginning. When it began to collapse, Pamela decided to return to the United States, taking her 2 children with her. In 1978, she moved to California in search of a better life. As a single mother, she could no longer work as a flight attendant for obvious reasons, so she tried her hand in various fields of activity. She worked as an accountant, a salesperson in a fashion boutique, and a manager in a computer company, but felt that none of these jobs were right for her. Nevertheless, Pamela continued to work to provide for herself and her children while also attending film school at the University of California. This path became more successful. Pamela enjoyed realizing herself in cinema, and eventually, she became a producer. Pamela's career took off during her 3rd year of film school when she met her future second husband, Daniel Horowitz, who was a lawyer. He was a professional in his field, combining private practice with creative writing. Daniel wrote a script and saw great potential in it. He began looking for a producer who might be interested in his vision. His friend Tamara found out about the script and introduced them. Pamela became interested in the script, and thus a romance blossomed. A month later, she moved closer to him, and they began working together. Daniel and Pamela prospered financially. Thanks to Daniel's advocacy work, he gained popularity, which brought him many famous and wealthy clients. He frequently commented on high-profile criminal cases on television, even weighing in on the Michael Jackson case. Their inner circle knew Daniel and Pamela as happy people who sincerely loved each other, got along well. They seemed not just like spouses but also like best friends who understood each other perfectly. They had a bright future ahead of them. The next step they decided to take was to buy a big house together, unaware of how tragically their happiness could end. Around 6 p.m. on October 15, 2005, Daniel returned home after work. At that time, they lived in a prestigious area of a small town located approximately 30 kilometers from the city. Daniel had recently acquired a plot of land and moved in with his wife, while her children had already grown up and were living separately. Though they were a wealthy couple, they were living in a trailer because their dream home was still under construction. They were so close to realizing this dream that they were willing to endure any inconvenience. When Daniel returned home, he immediately noticed something odd. Pamela's car was near the trailer, although she should still have been at dance class. He initially brushed it off, thinking she had simply returned home early. Daniel took 2 bags of groceries and approached the trailer door, but froze in place as he saw a large stain of blood on the ground. His heart raced, but he tried to shake the thought away. However, when he opened the door and went inside, he found his wife on the floor in a fetal position, covered in blood. Daniel knew how to provide first aid, so he leaned over her body to turn her over. In that moment, he realized she was dead. She was cold to the touch and clearly had died several hours prior. Rigor mortis had already set in. He called emergency services and reported the incident. After hanging up, he leaned over his wife's body again and screamed so loudly that neighbors all over the area heard his heartbreaking cries. On the morning of the tragedy, apparently, someone had come in early that morning. Pamela opened the door, which led to an altercation. She managed to push a large TV toward her attacker, probably trying to defend herself, leaving traces of her bloody hands on it. Pamela desperately fought for her life. A mix of her blood and the attacker's was found on the floor. Particles of skin from the murderer were found under her fingernails. Despite her desperate resistance, Pamela was brutally beaten to death. The forensic examination revealed that Pamela had a broken nose and several knocked-out teeth. She was killed by blunt force trauma to the head, which caused massive hemorrhaging in her brain. The attack was so brutal that portions of her scalp were torn off, and there were fractures on her skull. The attackers even inflicted wounds on her stomach and left a symbol on her back that looked like the letter H. It appeared that the attacker had spent considerable time in the trailer with Pamela. The detectives discovered that someone had taken the water and bathed, leaving behind smeared blood. It was possible that some of the cuts on Pamela were inflicted after her death. Naturally, detectives first suspected Daniel himself, as this crime was committed with extreme cruelty. In such cases, it is often found that the guilty party is a close person with a motive. In any case, Daniel had a reliable alibi. Several people could vouch for him that day. It was a usual day for a lawyer. He left the house around 8 a.m. and did not return until 6 p.m. The high-profile murder of a famous female producer attracted wide media attention, and this case was actively covered on television. Numerous rumors immediately began to circulate. It was about a prosperous, developing area with wealthy residents, where such a massacre of an innocent person was least expected. The local community wanted to know the truth before the next attack happened. It was necessary to stop the bloodthirsty criminal. Pamela was found in her underwear. Here were no traces of a break-in, which confirmed their suspicions. Only a husband or lover came to mind. There was no evidence of abuse, and nothing was missing from the trailer, despite the fact that the wealthy couple had a lot of valuables inside. This meant that theories involving abuse or robbery were unlikely. Nevertheless, even after the alibi was confirmed, the rumors did not stop. Some speculated that Daniel could not have committed the crime himself. As a lawyer, he constantly communicated with potentially dangerous people who could easily have carried out something similar at his behest. Detectives carefully checked this theory, analyzing the data on his computer and phone. However, they found no grounds for suspicion against Daniel and could not confirm that Pamela had a lover. Nevertheless, law enforcement officials did not abandon the idea that the criminal must have been well acquainted with Pamela. He was probably a resident of the area. This theory was not without foundation, as a statement was found in a trailer indicating harassment. According to Daniel, they had been persecuted for quite some time. As a result, he even left a restraining order against one of their neighbors to Pamela, but he never filed the documents with the court. Daniel admitted that there had been difficulties with one local resident who did not like them. However, he managed to reach an agreement with this person after weeks of bickering, and the problems ended without filing a complaint. He kept the restraining order just in case something happened again. The check on this neighbor yielded no results, as he was away at the time of the attack and had a reliable alibi. He was subsequently excluded from the list of suspects. On the day Pamela was buried, a press conference was held, during which the police announced the arrest of the probable killer. It turned out to be a 16-year-old teenager named Scott Dileski, who was just 2 weeks away from his 17th birthday. He did not personally know Pamela's family, but the victim's husband, Daniel, had helped his mother, Esther Fielding, with paperwork. Scott's family was experiencing financial difficulties, so Daniel did not even take money for his assistance. This was the unexpected price for his kindness. Scott Dileski was born in San Francisco. Soon after his birth, his parents divorced, and Esther raised the boy. Quite quickly, she found a new partner and remarried. Scott claimed that his stepfather could be cruel, but his mother had never witnessed any such incidents. Information about the early years of his life is contradictory. Some claim his stepfather could indeed be cruel, while others deny it. There is also conflicting information about the mother's attitude towards her son. Despite the difficulties with the family, when his father offered for him to move in, Scott refused. Shortly before Pamela's murder, Esther got divorced again, leading to financial problems and an acute housing crisis. She and her son were left without a place to stay, and Esther desperately sought employment. But finding a job while dealing with housing issues proved difficult. Fortunately, friends extended a helping hand, offering to temporarily move in with them. Esther and Scott were offered to settle on a property in a trailer. In fact, the living conditions were modest, but they had no choice. During this period, Scott was going through a transitional phase, showing signs of rebelliousness. As a pleasant but peculiar young man, he had previously been a Boy Scout and a baseball player. Before moving, he had studied quite well. Coincidentally, A chain of tragic events had been triggered by the loss of a loved one. Shortly before the move, Scott's half-sister died in a car accident. This serious incident caused significant psychological distress for him. Many believe that his mother's indifference led to negative changes in his behavior, but she did not remain idle. She tried to support her family during that time. Scott became increasingly detached from society and closed off, exhibiting low energy. His behavior also took on some strange characteristics. For instance, he once drew a pentagram and danced around it. This was only an external manifestation of his problems, while those who constantly interacted with Scott did not notice any significant alarming changes in his behavior. He became increasingly immersed in dark thoughts and began to write disturbing poems, probably to attract his mother's attention. Esther was sure that her son simply exhibited quirks. She did not speak of him as a difficult child. She believed that Scott was going through a challenging period in his own way due to the death of his sister and the financial difficulties their family faced. Esther remembered how he previously could not even stand the sight of blood, but when the police first spoke to him, he claimed that at the age of 12, he had tried various illegal substances. Gradually, Scott showed an increasing interest in crime. He read a lot about serial killers and school shootings, spoke more often about these topics, showing an unhealthy fascination. Friends noticed that he was becoming increasingly distant. When detectives looked at Scott's computer, even more questions arose. They found very disturbing content, particularly concerning the practice of cutting up animals. One of Scott's friends, whom he met after the move, said that not long before Pamela's murder, they had decided to sell a truck, viewing it as the only way to improve their lives financially. The teenagers needed money. A solution was found quickly. They lived in a wealthy area, so they decided to put in some effort to earn the necessary amount. Scott, whose demeanor was becoming increasingly gloomy, decided to take the path of crime and rob a house, launching another chain of alarming events. Shortly before Pamela's death, a woman named Karen contacted the police, noting that a purchase she did not make had been charged to her credit card. An order from an online store was delivered to a nearby house where Esther and Scott lived. Someone from this household had purchased special lighting equipment for growing illegal plants. All of this led to Esther, as it was under her name that the suspicious order was made. However, Karen did not want to contact the police immediately. Esther was outraged by what she perceived as slander and believed that they were trying to put her in a bad light. Esther denied that she had ordered anything similar on the internet. However, the property owners suspected something was wrong and checked Scott's computer. Under pressure, Scott quickly confessed that he had come up with a fraudulent plan involving credit cards and that he had ordered the lighting fixtures. Soon after, Pamela died. In response to this incident, the parents of Scott's accomplice pressured him to confess to the scam, fearing that the young people could be involved in much more serious offenses. Maybe, the fraud involving the credit cards led to a robbery that ended in murder. His parents insisted that the accomplice go to the police station and confess everything. Interestingly, when he left the interrogation room, the detectives had in their hands a story that Scott had killed his neighbor. The young man who testified about all of this received immunity from prosecution for providing testimony. It was he who had pushed Scott into fraud and suggested that he engage in illegal activities. When the police came to arrest Scott, he was not at home. Esther was detained and admitted that her son was at a nearby location with his girlfriend. Less than an hour later, he was arrested along with Esther, who was also considered a participant. Esther and her son were held in custody for destruction of evidence and possibly for murder. Bail for Esther was set at $500. The suspicion against her arose from the story about a backpack that contained details of accounts and numbers of people from whom Scott had stolen money or planned to steal. Several people had already suffered due to the swindler. Esther's actions were viewed as criminal. The night after Pamela's murder, she contacted Scott to inform him of police activity in their area and asked him not to come home. Scott told her about the records and the backpack containing the data, asking her to throw it away, which she did. Esther insisted she was simply afraid for her son's safety. Scott was with his girlfriend, named Jenna Reddy. She later also ended up at the station, even testified against her boyfriend at the trial. She stated that he often talked about different ways of killing, For example, that shooting a person is less painful than beating them to death with a bat or stabbing them with a knife. According to Jenna, Scott often wondered how long it takes to beat someone to death and was obsessed with this topic. After the crime against Pamela, when they pressured Esther, she quickly agreed to cooperate with the authorities, receiving guarantees for protection from criminal prosecution. She denied any connection to her neighbor's murder. However, opinions about Esther were very conflicting. Some believed that she lived for her son, while her ex-husband did not share this belief. In any case, Esther changed her testimony, clearly trying to justify herself. Mainly, Esther talked about the backpack that she had thrown away. She did not know all the contents but believed they were unrelated to the murder. There was data on all the people who had become victims of Scott's fraudulent scheme. Esther helped find some items they had tried to destroy, including shoes and gloves that had blood stains on them. An examination showed that the items contained the blood of Pamela. Scott also left a shoe imprint at the crime scene, and samples of his DNA were found on Pamela's foot. In Scott's room, handwritten notes were discovered, some of which contained information about accounts of people who were likely to have been deceived by the same fraudulent scheme. In addition, there were plans to kidnap people. Apparently, Scott was ready to make money by any means, regardless of the seriousness of the crimes. There were also descriptions of how to get rid of evidence. All this confirmed the guilt of him. There were many coincidences. Even the symbol carved on the back of Pamela resembled the signatures that Scott used. A public defender was appointed at the beginning of the trial. However, there was also strong evidence against Scott that came to court. He was the complete opposite of his Gothic image during the investigation. All this was part of the defense attorney's strategy to humanize a dangerous killer in front of the jury in order to acquit him. According to Scott's version of events told before the trial, on the day of the murder, he decided to take a walk towards a local waterfall. He returned from this walk with serious injuries. According to him, while he was walking, he accidentally met a strange woman who attacked him, resulting in his injuries. By an amazing coincidence, she was Pamela, so the blood stains on both her and his clothes matched the DNA of the victim. He claimed that she had clawed his face, cut his wrist, and injured his hand. When he was arrested, the injuries were still fresh. Naturally, his story sounded unrealistic. Why would Pamela attack Scott at the waterfall? What happened to her afterward? How she ended up in the house, and who attacked her were all major questions. The evidence against Scott included all his browser queries related to animal cruelty, his obsession with crimes, plans for murder, material evidence, blood on items, confessions from friends of his girlfriend and her mother. The lawyer tried to highlight his best qualities and described him as a decent guy, but against the overwhelming evidence presented by the prosecutor's office, it seemed futile. The only point that might have raised doubt, as stated by the lawyer, was the discovery of DNA samples. In addition to Scott's and Pamela's blood, traces of an unidentified person were found in the house. The defense attorney insisted that the detectives overlooked this evidence from the start and focused solely on proving Scott's guilt. The prosecution argued that the evidence against Scott was too substantial to be dismissed, while the evidence suggesting Scott's innocence was virtually insignificant. The jury went into deliberation to decide Scott's fate. It took them 18 hours to reach a decision, ultimately sparing him from the death penalty, as they chose to try him as a minor. It was assumed that he would serve the rest of his life in prison. Scott was found guilty of first-degree murder a month before the final round of hearings was held. Pamela's husband took the stand and stated that in his many years as a lawyer, he had represented at least 50 different murderers but had never seen a total lack of remorse like Scott's. Daniel believed that Scott had no redeeming qualities that would allow for parole eligibility. He deserved to be in prison for the rest of his life, and so it happened. Scott Dileski was sentenced to life imprisonment. He was to remain in a juvenile facility until he turned 18 and then be transferred to an adult prison. Immediately after Scott turned 18, he appealed to have his sentence reviewed, but his efforts were in vain. In 2009, Scott filed a claim that his rights had been violated. He wanted to change the venue of the hearing and claimed that some evidence which could refute the appeal was also rejected. The next attempt was made in 2011, where he pointed to evidence indicating the involvement of an unknown person in the murder, specifically claiming that the authorities did not even attempt to identify who owned all the DNA traces found in the trailer where Pamela died. He insisted that the nature of the crime indicated a personal motive. Scott himself allegedly did not know Pamela, and it made no sense for him to kill her, especially with such cruelty. Additionally, the detectives claimed that the criminal remained in the trailer for an extended period, consistent with the timeline, but Scott asserted that he had been at home during that time. Again, his arguments did not lead to any significant changes. Another appeal was filed in 2016, with Scott insisting that his life sentence was wrongful because he was a minor at the time of the crime. The appeal was accepted for consideration. During his imprisonment, state laws were revised to prohibit life sentences for minors without the possibility of parole, and he was automatically given the opportunity for early release after serving 25 years in prison. In 2030, Scott will have the chance to present his case for release. However, whether this release will be approved by the commission remains uncertain. It is difficult to predict the outcome, but it is known that Scott became an exemplary prisoner. He did not drop out of school and continued to receive an education within the prison walls. Pamela's family stated that they would definitely be present at the parole board hearing to prevent him from being released, viewing him as an especially dangerous criminal. Daniel never finished building the house he dreamed of with his wife. He was forced to sell the land along with the partially built house because he simply wanted to forget everything that had happened and start life anew. Katrina Wright's Brau was originally from Germany. There, she met an American serviceman named Charles, and they fell in love and got married. After their wedding, Charles brought Katrina to the United States, where they settled in a small town called Ayer, Massachusetts, which had around 5,000 residents. Together, they had 2 children, a son and a daughter. After leaving the military, Charles worked at a local factory that made knives and surgical instruments, providing for the family while Katrina stayed at home as a housewife. Katrina and Charles enjoyed a long life together filled with happy moments. As their children grew up and started their own lives, Katrina remained active, social, and energetic. When her children visited on weekends, she joyfully danced and had fun with her daughter. It was often hard to find her at home. In contrast, Charles was quiet, reserved, and calm. In 1980, Katrina was on the verge of realizing her long-held dream. She wanted to return to Germany to see how her home country had changed and to visit relatives and friends with whom she had kept in touch through letters over the years. To make this trip possible, she saved money for a long time but was so anxious about the possibility of her savings being stolen that she carried a large amount of cash in an envelope with her everywhere she went. This included outings to local restaurants with friends and family. When they learned about her money-carrying habit, they were surprised and often questioned her reasoning. It seemed odd to them that Katrina wasn't afraid to walk around with so much cash, especially since it posed a risk to her safety. However, Katrina believed that leaving the money at home unattended was even riskier. She felt that if she kept cash, her travel savings would be safe. At 48 years old, she truly thought her concerns were unfounded, at least until May 21, 1980. On that day, as usual, Charles left for work around 7 a.m., while Katrina stayed home a bit longer before heading to her job. However, by 10 a.m., her colleagues began to worry because she had not arrived at work. This was unusual for her. They attempted to call her, but she didn't answer. They also couldn't reach Charles, as he was out of contact during his shift, and mobile phones had not yet been invented. To save time, her colleagues began contacting the couple's closest relatives whose phone numbers they had. They were able to reach the daughter-in-law who lived next door to Katrina. She agreed to check on Katrina. At 10:45, she went to the address. She knocked on the door and windows several times, but there was no response. Her calls went unanswered, and the windows were tightly covered. When she tried to get inside, she found the front door was unlocked. As soon as she opened the door, it was clear that a struggle had occurred in the house. In the kitchen, she found Katrina lying on the floor, bleeding and unresponsive. The room showed signs of a violent confrontation, with furniture, appliances, and books scattered all around. The sink was soaked with water and blood, creating a horrifying scene. The daughter-in-law immediately called 911 for help, hoping that Katrina could be saved. However, she was too scared to remain in the house and waited for emergency responders outside. Paramedics quickly arrived at the house but were unable to save Katrina, who had already died. Detectives were immediately on the scene to investigate the crime. It became clear that the likely killer knew Katrina, as evidenced by the violence of the attack and the fact that the windows and locks were undamaged. This suggested that Katrina either let the attacker in willingly or he had a key. The assault took place in the kitchen, where the attacker used water to wash something in the sink, likely his hands or face. The kitchen remained messy, with blood and water splattered around. A faint fingerprint was discovered on the screen, while a clearer print was found on a toaster lying on the floor. Additionally, several hairs were found clutched in Katrina's fist, likely pulled from the attacker during a struggle. Unfortunately, DNA analysis techniques were still in their infancy at that time, so investigators could only collect and store the evidence for future analysis. Forensic scientists focused on the fingerprints they found. An expert determined that Katrina had been attacked multiple times. The suspected murder weapon, a paring knife, was discovered in the trash under the sink. The murder occurred in the kitchen, and it was clear that the house had been ransacked. The victim, Katrina, had her jewelry stolen, along with an envelope containing money she had saved for a trip back to her homeland. Initially, law enforcement believed the motive behind the crime was the stolen money. However, Katrina was determined to keep her savings, which led her to fight back against the robber, resulting in her tragic death. The numerous stab wounds also suggested a possible personal motive. Investigators looked into Katrina's personal life but found no one who could commit such a violent act. She did not have any obvious enemies and was not vocal about having money in her home, with only her closest friends knowing about her savings. This limited circle led them to suspect her husband, Charles. They theorized that the murder might have taken place before he left for work around 7 a.m. Evidence linked the murder weapon, a knife, to Charles, as it was produced by the company where he worked. He acknowledged that this knife was often used in their kitchen. While many residents owned similar knives, the knife in question had been thoroughly cleaned, which raised suspicions. During the interrogation, Charles expressed deep sorrow over his wife's death. He had been married to her for decades and appeared genuinely grief-stricken. Still, the fact that the perpetrator used a kitchen knife instead of a premeditated weapon was unusual for such a crime. Despite his apparent distress, Charles was subjected to a polygraph test, which he passed. In addition to the numerous stab wounds, Katrina had suffered a blow to the head from a blunt object, likely a lamp found broken near her body in the kitchen. Ultimately, with the collection of fingerprints and blood samples from the scene and after questioning Charles, the police decided to send him home. From the beginning, he was hesitant to go home because it reminded him of the tragedy. In 1980, there were no specialized companies for crime scene cleanup, so he had to rely on his relatives for assistance. Consequently, Katrina's daughter and daughter-in-law ended up cleaning the kitchen and removing blood from various surfaces. They also expressed their concerns to the authorities, who believed that Katrina's attacker might have been someone she knew personally. To understand what happened, they explored various possibilities. During their conversations, they recalled a 25-year-old man named Kenneth Walters. Born on August 16, 1953, Kenneth was 26 at the time of the crime. He comes from a large, troubled family. He lives near Katrina, and some of his relatives are facing legal troubles. Kenneth himself had a history of minor criminal offenses. Before reaching adulthood, he had been arrested for participating in a knife fight. Since it was his first offense, he received a fine and was required to perform community service. A few weeks prior to Katrina's death, Kenneth had attacked law enforcement officers. Although a trial was scheduled for the day she was murdered, he was released on bail beforehand. Kenneth worked as a cook at a restaurant that Katrina frequently visited to spend time with her friends and family. While she did not interact with him directly, he might have learned about her possessing a large sum of money, possibly by overhearing her conversations during his shifts. Katrina's daughter and daughter-in-law informed the police of their suspicions regarding him. Law enforcement officers decided to investigate Kenneth as a potential suspect in the murder. They spoke with him, but he denied any involvement and did not show any typical signs of a murderer. However, his previous involvement in a knife fight raised suspicions against him. When the police interviewed Kenneth again, he provided a solid alibi, supported by documentation. He had a time card that clearly indicated the hours he worked at the restaurant, which confirmed his statement. His colleagues, who were on duty with him that night, also verified his alibi. Kenneth explained that he left home the night before at 10 p.m., worked the night shift, and did not leave the restaurant until around 9 a.m. the next morning. A friend drove him back home, where his girlfriend could also confirm his presence. He did not stay long at home. He quickly changed clothes, took a shower, and left. By 10 a.m., he was attending a court hearing related to an incident involving a police officer. Given his tight schedule, he simply did not have the opportunity to commit the crime before his court appearance. Kenneth dressed neatly and left for court, where he remained until 11 a.m. Afterward, he returned to the restaurant and stayed there until 12:30 p.m. When he got home, he encountered the police, who were canvassing the neighborhood. They spoke with him, examined his clothes and body for any blood or scratches, finding none, which did not raise any suspicion. A forensic expert determined that the murder occurred around 7 a.m., likely soon after her husband Charles left for work. Detectives believed the crime could have taken place between 7 and 10:45 a.m., when the body was discovered. Given the limited time Kenneth had before the trial, it seemed unlikely that he could have committed the crime and escaped unnoticed. After verifying Kenneth's alibi, he was removed from the list of suspects due to a lack of evidence of criminal activity. However, investigators did not completely rule him out of the investigation as the case progressed, though they did not find any new evidence. Fingerprints retrieved from the crime scene did not match any in existing databases, which were not very advanced at that time. The investigation stalled for 2 years with little to no progress. During this time, a man named Robert Osborne contacted the police, claiming he had important information regarding Catherine's murder. However, he expected to receive a reward for his testimony. Detectives indicated that a reward could only be offered to someone providing valuable information that led to an arrest. Robert suggested that law enforcement should interview Kenneth's ex-girlfriend, Brenda Marsh. At the time of the call, Robert was dating Brenda and was familiar with Kenneth's situation. He claimed that Kenneth had confessed to the murder during a private conversation. By the time the police received this tip, Brenda had already broken up with Kenneth, who was living elsewhere. Brenda confirmed that at the time of Katrina's murder, she and Kenneth were living together. She described Kenneth as rude and cruel. Brenda had a daughter with him, and they were struggling financially. Following the advice of Robert, her new boyfriend, she decided to turn Kenneth in, hoping to receive a reward that would help her situation. According to Brenda, on the evening of May 20, 1980, Kenneth left their home around 10 p.m. to go to work at a restaurant. However, when they called the restaurant later, they found out that Kenneth had not arrived there at the expected time. Brenda was uncertain about what time Kenneth returned home or whether he had gone to the restaurant at all. The next morning, he came back with a deep, fresh scratch on his face that was still bleeding. When Brenda asked him about it, he replied that it was none of her business. He quickly changed his clothes, took a shower, and left for a court appointment. When Kenneth returned from court regarding an assault case, Brenda informed him that the police were already investigating at their home. Kenneth was very upset about this and told Brenda that if the police asked her about him, she should say he hadn't lived there for about a month. After the investigation stalled, they relocated and waited a bit to avoid drawing attention to their escape. Brenda attempted to inquire about the incident with Kenneth, but he brushed off her concerns, stating that it was none of her business. However, one night, while drunk, he revealed that he had interacted with a German woman to take her money. Kenneth's testimony was contradicted by his time card, which showed he arrived at work on time and left only at 9 a.m. Brenda's statements also conflicted with the fact that Kenneth spoke to the police when he returned home and had no visible scratches on his face. Brenda's suspicions seemed unfounded. She could simply be a scorned ex seeking revenge on Kenneth. To clarify the situation, she was offered a polygraph test, which she took in past. The detectives then decided to conduct a further investigation into Kenneth's background. They found another ex-girlfriend who claimed that Kenneth had also confessed to murdering a German woman, whom he referred to casually. Despite this new testimony, there was still little evidence against him. The fingerprints found on the toaster and faucet in the kitchen where Katrina died did not match Kenneth. This investigation took place in 1982, before DNA testing was available. To eliminate any doubts, they compared Kenneth's blood type with the blood found at the scene, and they matched it. The detectives viewed this as solid evidence of Kenneth's guilt, despite the low accuracy of such comparisons. It appeared that the prosecutor was eager to close the case quickly and needed someone to blame. Given the personal nature of the crime and its brutality, the police decided to thoroughly search for a possible motive. Kenneth had a difficult childhood that significantly shaped his life. He harbored a long-standing dislike for Katrina, feeling resentful towards her and her children. They all grew up together, and Katrina's children often boasted about their pocket money, which upset Kenneth because his family struggled financially. One day, driven by frustration, Kenneth and his sister broke into Katrina's house, stealing sweets and money from her children's piggy bank. At that time, Kenneth was only 10 years old. Katrina was understandably furious and insisted on taking action against him for his unacceptable behavior. Then, Kenneth was taken from his family and placed in a juvenile correctional facility at age 10. There, he faced harsh conditions alongside older teens who had committed more serious offenses. Kenneth found this experience traumatic and rarely spoke about it, yet he held a deep resentment towards Katrina for her role in his imprisonment. Despite the hostility he faced from others, his sister, Betty Ann, supported him. Although she was younger, Betty was very close to Kenneth and always believed he was innocent. Despite Betty's support, Kenneth was arrested 2 years after Katrina's tragic death and charged with her murder. The hearing was set for 1983. Kenneth remained calm about the upcoming trial, confident in his alibi, which was supported by a timesheet. However, from the very beginning, the odds were stacked against him. His former girlfriend, Brenda, testified against him, sharing even more information than before. She claimed to have been in close contact with a friend of Katrina's who had previously dated Kenneth. Catherine's friend stated that Kenneth had given her a ring a few months after Catherine's death. Upon seeing the ring, Brenda realized it resembled one she had seen on Katrina before the murder. Photos of the ring were presented as evidence during the trial. The prosecution utilized clever tactics and presented various pieces of circumstantial evidence. Kenneth's lawyer believed he had a good chance of avoiding a conviction and advised him not to testify in his own defense. However, when it was time to present evidence of Kenneth's innocence, the timesheet had mysteriously disappeared. Without it, and relying only on his family's claims that he was a good person, there was no substantial proof to support his innocence. Consequently, Kenneth Walters was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The defense argued that Kenneth was fortunate that the state did not have the death penalty, otherwise, he would have faced execution. Kenneth maintained his innocence and requested a retrial, but only his sister Betty supported him. Others believed she was too emotionally attached and forgave him for his past mistakes. His history of wrongdoings influenced the jury's decision against him. Initially, his lawyer believed in his innocence and worked diligently to exonerate him. However, all appeals were denied. As time passed, the lawyer's enthusiasm dwindled. Kenneth lost the opportunity to have his case reconsidered and was left to serve a life sentence in prison. His family believed his imprisonment was due to his lack of financial resources. He could not afford a skilled lawyer. After all his appeals were turned down, no attorney wanted to take on his case. Kenneth accepted his fate, but Betty remained determined. She frequently visited him in prison and continued to believe in his innocence, steadfastly pursuing justice on his behalf. Kenneth had a difficult personality and frequently caused problems in prison, which made it hard for anyone to make excuses for his behavior. He even tried to end his life out of despair. During one visit, Betty was unable to see him because he was in solitary confinement after getting into a fight with another inmate. Once he was released from solitary, they were able to meet, and Betty had a heartfelt conversation with him, expressing her determination to help him get out of prison. Their trust in lawyers had faded, especially since many refused to take on Kenneth's case. Betty felt she could only rely on herself. At that time, she hadn't completed high school and lacked the necessary education. She had also divorced her husband, who had discouraged her from helping Kenneth. As a single mother of two, she worked as a waitress, struggling to support herself and her children, but she remained committed to helping Kenneth. Betty first focused on finishing high school and then enrolled in college. She managed to balance her night shifts as a waitress while raising her kids. Despite the challenges, her determination and strong feelings propelled her forward. Betty eventually became a lawyer, fully knowledgeable about Kenneth's case but puzzled about how his timesheet went missing. Additionally, she discovered that Brenda, who reported a large scratch on Kenneth's face the day Katrina was murdered, had lied, as Kenneth had been in court, then at a restaurant, and later speaking with detectives. Those reports did not mention any injuries on Kenneth. It was odd that no one else noticed the scratch. Detectives typically pay close attention to such details, especially since Kenneth was one of the suspects from the beginning. Betty continuously reviewed the evidence and found substantial confirmation of her suspicions. Furthermore, she learned that Brenda did not actually take a polygraph test. Instead, Brenda only passed a voice test, which can indicate lies but is less reliable than a polygraph. Kenneth successfully passed the lie detector test, which should have worked in his favor, but this detail was not mentioned during the trial. As Betty investigated the circumstances surrounding Kenneth's conviction, she increasingly realized that law enforcement had seemingly chosen him as a scapegoat. Brenda went to the police after realizing that Kenneth had received a life sentence and admitted that she had lied under pressure from Robert, who hoped to gain financially. She also desired revenge on her ex, Kenneth, and felt pressured by the police. Now, she regretted that her actions had led to an innocent man being imprisoned for life. Another ex-girlfriend also revealed that she testified against Kenneth due to pressure from a female police officer who had a personal bias against him and was intent on seeing him convicted. It wasn't until 1999 that Betty gained access to significant evidence, specifically DNA samples collected from the crime scene. She uncovered a box of documents and samples, including blood and hair, that had never been analyzed before. The examination revealed that the DNA from the crime scene did not match Kenneth's. However, both law enforcement and the public worked to prevent the case from being reopened, while Katrina's family strongly resisted any new investigation. In 2000, Betty successfully reached out to the Innocence Project, a group of lawyers dedicated to assisting wrongfully convicted individuals. This organization had a team of experts and the resources needed to conduct thorough investigations. Betty presented evidence proving Kenneth's innocence, convincing the project to take on his case. She also contacted a female police officer involved in the investigation, who had a questionable reputation and had previously compromised her credibility in another case. Many in law enforcement spoke poorly of her, raising suspicions that she had intentionally framed Kenneth and had not lost key evidence by chance. Furthermore, inconsistencies in the testimonies of Kenneth's former girlfriends were exposed, particularly regarding a ring that was shown to the jury. It was discovered that the ring had been sent to Germany and did not match the jewelry owned by Kenneth's ex-girlfriend. It was smaller and unsuitable for Katrina. Betty sought to find the ring to counter another piece of evidence against Kenneth. She learned that the ring had initials engraved on it that did not belong to Katrina. Ultimately, due to Betty's extensive efforts in uncovering these discrepancies, the case was reopened, and the prosecutor dropped the charges against Kenneth. After spending 18 years, 5 months, and 10 days in prison, Kenneth was finally acquitted and became a free man. He was able to enjoy life again after being deprived of it for so long. Unfortunately, tragedy struck. On September 19, 2001, while visiting his brother's house, Kenneth decided to take a shortcut that required him to climb over a tall wall. He did not realize the wall on the other side was even higher. When he jumped from a height of 15 feet, he fell awkwardly, struck his head, and later died in the hospital. Betty, Kenneth's sister, remembered that those 6 months after his release were the happiest of his life. After so many years in prison, everything felt new to him. Even after his death, Betty continued to fight for justice. In 2004, she filed a lawsuit against the city for the wrongful imprisonment of Kenneth and the impact it had on their lives. By 2009, she successfully won the case, receiving $10.5 million in compensation. In this story, Katrina's murder case remains unsolved and often forgotten. The blood found at the crime scene was tested, but no matches were found in the police database. The identity of the person who brutally took her life remains unknown. Her family hopes that one day, the case will be solved. Kathleen Daphne and David Franklin Bagby met in the 1960s when they went to Disneyland with mutual friends. At that time, David was serving in the U.S. Marine Corps. He was intelligent, charming, and sociable, which caught Kathleen's attention right away. They quickly found harmony, chatting throughout the trip, and soon after meeting, they became inseparable. After just 5 months, they decided to get married. After that, they settled in San Diego, California. Kathleen began her career as a nurse, while David became a software engineer after completing his military service. They wanted to have children, but for many years, they focused on their careers in the medical field. At that time, planning a family was not as common as it is today. Still, Kathleen tried to conceive. They also considered adopting from an orphanage. Finally, their joy came when they had a baby boy named Andrew. The family of 3 then moved to the suburbs of San Jose. From a young age, Andrew was friendly and outgoing, participating in various activities and earning awards for his hard work. He had a best friend named Kurt, with whom he shared a passion for creating funny videos. Andrew was very close to his family and prioritized spending time with them. When he started college, he began dating Heather, who was also studying in a similar field. Andrew aspired to become a doctor, inspired by his mother's nursing career. This shared interest deepened their bond, as they often discussed medicine together. The family appeared to be very harmonious and seemed like a model for others. After college, Andrew applied to multiple medical schools but was only accepted to one, which was a significant disappointment for him. He felt anxious and planned to reapply the following year, intending to work in the meantime to ease the financial burden on his parents. Just days after receiving the rejections, Kathleen discovered an envelope from Memorial University of Newfoundland in Canada, which contained an acceptance letter for Andrew. The letter had been misplaced among other mail. This news drastically changed Andrew's life. In 1995, he moved to St. John's, Canada, where the university was located. The following year, Heather also decided to attend the same university and moved there, but their relationship began to struggle after a few months. A traumatic experience unfolded for Andrew when his girlfriend, Heather, unexpectedly ended their engagement without any explanation. To cope with this pain, he focused intensely on his studies. This continued until his 3rd year of college, when, in the spring of 1999, he met a woman named Shirley Turner. This marked Andrew's first relationship after his breakup with Heather. Initially, everyone, especially his friends and family, welcomed the news, relieved that he was open to dating again. However, the initial happiness was short-lived. Shirley was significantly older than Andrew. He was 26, and she was 38. This age difference led to misunderstandings between them. Shirley had graduated from Memorial University and worked as a teacher for many years. In the mid-1990s, she decided to return to school for medical training and earned her diploma in 1998, becoming a resident in various hospitals. By this time, Shirley had gained a questionable reputation for allegedly mistreating patients and being involved in conflicts. One of her former managers noted that he often felt manipulated during their communications. She was known to lie frequently, which contributed to many disputes. From the start of their relationship, Shirley was very controlling. She wants to be with Andrew all the time, but his friends find her reliance a bit excessive. She often touches and hugs him inappropriately while discussing their relationship, which makes him feel uncomfortable. When Shirley learned about Andrew's attractive ex-fiancée, Heather, she became visibly upset and started contacting other women to brag about her relationship with Andrew. This behavior tarnished her reputation, and Andrew's friends and family began to dislike her. They subtly suggested that he could find someone better, given his kind nature and good looks. However, after breaking up with Heather, Andrew struggles with low self-esteem and genuinely feels that Shirley is the best person he could have. After graduating from university in 2000, Andrew moved to Syracuse, New York, hoping to find a job at a medical center. At the same time, Shirley relocated to Sac City, Iowa, a small town with a population of about 2,000, where she signed a 10-year contract to work at the county medical center. Andrew's family was relieved that the two had finally separated and would no longer be in contact. However, despite the distance, Shirley was determined to maintain her connection with Andrew and continued to pursue him. Andrew was very busy with work, which made it difficult for him to visit Shirley. However, Shirley often traveled on business trips to see him. During her visits, she often called him on his home or mobile phone. On one occasion, she stayed at his apartment until he had to leave for work. After they said goodbye, Shirley called him, claiming that she had left her purse behind. Andrew gave her his keys, and when he returned home from work, he discovered that many more items were missing than just her purse. This makes him doubt her honesty. However, despite feeling betrayed, Andrew still believes he doesn't deserve a better relationship and chooses to stay in his relationship with Shirley. About a year later, Andrew realized he was unhappy with his job and living situation, so he moved to Throop, Pennsylvania, a small town with a population of 88,000. By 2001, he decided to pursue a career in family medicine, believing that this community would be a perfect fit for his aspirations. He envisioned himself as a beloved local doctor, admired and respected by the residents. Although his dream was starting to materialize, Shirley's presence became a problem. She was still eager to be with him, but by then Andrew was tired of her clinginess and had focused entirely on his work. He wanted to break up, but Shirley seemed oblivious to his feelings and clung to the hope of eventually living together. Andrew began to ignore Shirley, but she became increasingly obsessed. She sends him 30 voice messages a day. Although Andrew was firm about ending the relationship, in September 2001, Shirley informed him that she was pregnant and claimed he was the father. Andrew felt happy about becoming a father, but he didn't want to be involved with such a clingy woman. He knew that Shirley would continue to interfere in his life, potentially sabotaging any new relationships. Every time he chats with a new girl, Shirley immediately recognizes it, contacts the girl, and informs her that she is pregnant with his child. Unsurprisingly, these new relationships never lasted. As time went on, Shirley publicized her pregnancy and Andrew's supposed fatherhood. Initially, she considered having an abortion but later announced her decision to keep the baby. Her manipulations worked. Within a month, she convinced Andrew to restart their relationship, and they even contemplated engagement. By late October 2001, Shirley met with Andrew's friends and family, and it was evident that she was pressuring him to reconcile. On November 3rd, she left for a trip, and Andrew hoped this distance would give him peace. However, just 2 days later, on the morning of November 5th, 2001, she showed up at his door again. Andrew needed to go to work and didn't want to engage with Shirley, but she insisted on having a serious conversation, so he reluctantly allowed her to stay in his apartment. He informed her that they could talk later at Keystone Park. Throughout his workday at the hospital, Andrew's colleagues noticed his anxiety. When they asked what was troubling him, he described his unsettling encounter with Shirley. They advised him to cut ties with her as soon as possible and not waste any more time. Determined to end the relationship, Andrew planned to meet Shirley that evening and hoped to be free by 7:30 p.m. He was looking forward to meeting his best friend Clark at a bar at 9 p.m. to celebrate his newfound freedom from her obsession. Clark arrived at the bar on time, but Andrew never showed up, which worried him since Andrew had never been late before. Clark assumed that Andrew's conversation with Shirley had run long and thought they would see each other in the morning at work. However, when that didn't happen and Andrew missed his shift the next day, Clark began to panic. Andrew didn't answer calls from Clark, his friends, or his parents. By 9 a.m., Clark considered calling the police, But he didn't have to. News broke on television that a man in medical attire had been found dead in Keystone Park. The man was identified as Andrew Bagby, who was 28 years old. A homeless person had found his body in the parking lot next to his car at 6 a.m. He had been attacked 5 times in the back, face, and chest, and it appeared he was attacked again in the back of the head while he was already down. Clark immediately contacted the police, informing them that they wouldn't have to search for the suspect long because he knew who Andrew had been with prior to the incident, Shirley. He explained their conflict and mentioned that Andrew had intended to break up with her that evening at Keystone Park. However, Shirley does not accept this and wants to get back together with Andrew. The connections were too apparent. The detectives took this information seriously and reached out to Shirley, who was already back in her hometown in Canada. She claimed that she had been in Iowa all day, sick, and then with her parents. This was clearly a lie because she went to talk to Andrew and stayed at his apartment. By this time, the police had interviewed many of Andrew's friends, colleagues, and relatives, all of whom pointed to Shirley as the person with whom he had conflicts. None believed her story. The key evidence came from a witness who saw a Toyota RAV4, matching Shirley's car, in the parking lot at 6:10 p.m. The authorities, however, chose to take their time, planning for the next 2 weeks to gather a solid case against her before filing charges. Evidence strongly suggested that Shirley was guilty. Her initial lie was quickly proven to be false, and CCTV footage, along with phone call records, showed that she had been near Andrew's house early that morning, November 5, 2001. Shirley had purchased a .22 caliber pistol and received firearms training from an instructor, who noted that the pistol had a peculiar malfunction. At the crime scene, police found 5 spent cartridges and 1 unspent cartridge, which could be linked to the malfunction, especially since Andrew was shot with the same type of weapon. The detectives wanted to examine Shirley's pistol, but she claimed she could not find it. She maintained that she had spent November 5th in bed in Iowa, but the police caught her in a lie when they presented CCTV evidence and call recordings from her journey to see Andrew. She left a considerable digital footprint, frequently contacting him in an attempt to rekindle their relationship. When Shirley arrived at Andrew's apartment that morning, he let her in and even allowed her to wait there until he returned from work. During her visit, a pack of condoms went missing from his home, and a pack from the same batch was subsequently found at Shirley's house in Iowa after the incident. This further indicated that she was not being truthful, as she seemed to forget critical details. It seemed strange that Heather also witnessed the tragic incident. Although she had tried to avoid meeting Shirley, Shirley managed to confront her. Shirley made statements claiming that Andrew loved her more and that their intimate relationship was more fulfilling. Their love, despite Andrew's passing, will forever be in heaven, which scares Heather so much that she decides to file a restraining order against Shirley. Notably, shortly after the funeral, Shirley quickly prepared to go to Canada to assist the authorities. In an effort to draw her back to the U.S., Andrew's family planned another memorial service and invited her, but she declined the invitation. Currently, U.S. police must cooperate with Canadian authorities due to procedural issues. This coordination is very slow, and in the meantime, Shirley may remain free. The Canadian police arrested her on December 12, 2001, but discussions about extradition had not yet begun because of additional bureaucratic hurdles. It was expected that she would remain in jail until then. However, she was released on bail the very next day. She was required to surrender her passport and report to the police weekly. Notably, her psychiatrist assisted in the process and even paid part of her bail. In addition, she was instructed to refrain from contacting 8 individuals who have restraining orders against her, including her ex-husband and several others. As detectives investigated Shirley's background, they were alarmed by her behavior. She had been married twice and had 2 children with her first husband. However, she had cheated on him with another man who became her second husband, with whom she had another child before getting divorced. In 1993, Shirley lived with a roommate who was appalled by her treatment of her children. Shirley often hit them, sometimes using objects, which led her roommate to move out and report Shirley's actions to the authorities. Witnesses confirmed that Shirley would physically abuse her children and leave them home alone for over a day. However, her second husband denied these allegations and claimed that she was a good mother. In January 1990, she relinquished custody of her children to their biological fathers and carried on as if nothing had happened. Later, detectives found another boyfriend, who described how cruel she was. On one occasion, she struck him in the face with her shoe multiple times, although he wasn't seriously injured. He decided to break up with her after finding her unconscious in her room, showing signs of prescription drug abuse. She was in her underwear, surrounded by roses and letters, including one addressed to her psychiatrist, in which she stated that she wasn't angry but merely unwell. Shirley's behavior was alarming, yet it seemed normal due to her lack of empathy and inadequate treatment, which allowed her to harm those close to her. This ultimately led to a tragic incident. After her release on bail, Shirley held a press conference revealing that she was 4 months pregnant. Upon learning this, Andrew's parents, Catherine and David, sold everything they owned and moved to Canada to seek custody of the child, believing that he is Andrew's son. Shirley's son, Zachary, was born on July 18, 2002, and a DNA test confirmed that Andrew was his father. However, when Catherine and David arrived at the hospital, Shirley refused to let them see their newborn grandson. Given Shirley's behavior with her other children, they feared for Zachary's safety and were distressed by the slow pace of the Canadian legal system. Their attempts to gain custody faced numerous obstacles, and they worried about Zachary's well-being under his mother's care. Extradition to the U.S. was repeatedly delayed for various reasons. In the end, Catherine and David were allowed only 1 hour a week to visit Zachary, and these meetings were monitored as if they posed a threat to him. They had to undergo searches before each visit. Despite these challenges, Zachary brought joy to them, who had lost their only child and were unable to have more. In November 2002, there was finally some progress. Shirley was incarcerated, and the process for extradition to the U.S. began. She willingly transferred full custody of Zachary to Andrew's parents, Catherine and David, but this transfer included certain stipulations. Shirley insisted on daily phone calls and required them to visit her in prison once a week. Catherine and David were diligent, never missing a visit to comply with her conditions, fearing that any sign of neglect could lead to her taking away their custody rights. In January 2003, Shirley was released from custody again. She had appealed directly to the judge in her case for advice on how to avoid prison before being extradited to the United States, as she wanted to take care of her son. To everyone's surprise, the judge met with her and provided detailed recommendations. Despite how unusual this was, Shirley followed the advice and was released. As a result, Kathleen and David once again lost full custody of Zachary but were permitted to spend more time with him without interference from Shirley or social workers. Even though Andrew's family was unhappy with the situation, the judge insisted there was no reason to fear for Zachary's safety. This was despite Shirley's past behavior, which included the suspicion of Andrew's murder and incidents of threatening another inmate with a fork during her imprisonment. Kathleen and David despised Shirley for killing their son, but they did their best to maintain their relationship with Zachary. It became clear that Shirley began to exploit this situation. She started to manipulate them. She frequently called them at all hours, demanding financial support. Additionally, she often brought up Andrew's death, a topic that Kathleen and David were desperate to avoid. During Zachary's birthday celebration at McDonald's, when he ran over to hug Grandma Kathleen, Shirley became furious. She yelled that she would not allow Kathleen to love him more than she loved him. From that moment on, Shirley made life difficult for Andrew's parents. It seemed she was not genuinely interested in keeping custody of the child. Instead, her primary goal appeared to be to cause trouble for them. A hearing regarding her extradition was scheduled for September 2003, and this would be the last step before she would be sent to the United States. While waiting for this hearing, Shirley began dating a new boyfriend. However, when he learned about her troubling past, he ended the relationship. As was typical for her, Shirley began stalking him, threatening him, and claiming she was pregnant. She repeatedly called and caused dramatic scenes, but he ignored her. On August 17th, she told a friend that she planned to take Zachary and go to her ex-boyfriend's house to settle things. Reports indicated she stopped on the road to ask for directions, which was the last time she and Zachary were seen alive. The following day, August 18, 2003, they vanished. No one could reach Shirley. That same day, a couple on vacation found the bodies of a woman and a small child about 20 minutes from St. John's. The police identified the boy as Zachary Turner. A forensic examination revealed that Shirley had taken an overdose of anxiety medication, and the same substance was discovered in a bottle of baby formula. A witness reported hearing a child crying near the beach around 2:30 a.m., but he couldn't locate the source. Forensic experts suggested that Shirley mixed her prescribed medication with Zachary's formula and subsequently began taking over-the-counter drugs. She then tied her son to her chest with a sweater and jumped into the ocean. Both drowned. Shirley's car was found near the house of the man she intended to visit that night. She left behind pictures of herself with Zachary and wrote a letter stating that the man had wanted her to do it. However, investigators realized this was part of her pattern of manipulation. She aimed to create problems for a man who had no knowledge of her plans. As expected, she was not actually pregnant, which was another form of deceit. Zachary's death brought unbearable sorrow to Kathleen and David. They cremated the boy just as they had done with his father, Andrew, and scattered his ashes in the same place where they had previously scattered his father's ashes. Later, David confessed that he felt so desperate about his grandson's safety and so frustrated with the Canadian authorities that he contemplated killing Shirley. He wanted to take matters into his own hands and confront the woman responsible for their pain. David kept this thought from Kathleen and now deeply regretted not acting on it. He believed that if he had, Zachary might still be alive and he and Kathleen would have been able to care for him. David abandoned this idea because he hoped that the hearing would ultimately result in Shirley's extradition to the United States. There, they will have greater opportunities to fight for custody of Zachary, the sole joy in their lives. When they learned that Zachary had died, they were heartbroken and even considered ending their own lives. However, they chose instead to pursue justice to prevent other families from experiencing similar tragedies. The situation became more difficult because their lawyers did not communicate with them. In the USA, Kathleen and David shared their story on television, feeling that the Canadian law enforcement system was primarily to blame for what had happened. They started a campaign against the psychiatrist who had helped secure Shirley's bail, which allowed her to be released during the investigation. This psychiatrist faced criticism and was fined. They also denounced the judge who had allowed her release, enabling her to endanger her child, Zachary. In October 2006, a child protection expert released a document of more than 500 pages, asserting that Zachary's death could have been avoided. This report spurred reforms in the Canadian judicial system. 3 years later, in October 2009, the Bill Zachary was introduced in the House of Commons, proposing significant changes to Canada's criminal law. This bill empowered judges to deny bail to individuals accused of serious crimes if they posed a threat to others.